Hello and welcome to the audiobook for my latest memoir, You Get Back Up, How I Healed from Rock Bottom. Chapter 28, Removing the Bug. My fist smashes into the wall of our Fredericksburg Airbnb and makes a hole in it. I feel rage. Why doesn't this woman ever respect my boundaries? I look over at Kiki, who looks visibly shook. My arms and legs shake as I sob uncontrollably. I start to dissociate 20 years into the past, where I'm in agony because I don't feel safe or seen. This isolated moment in time is who I am. This violent outburst is my identity. I am not someone that makes mistakes. I am a mistake. Days after this fight, we'll fight again. This time, we won't argue about unschooling and whether or not that's a smart alternative to a traditional education. We won't see our identities threatened in each other's words because she graduated from college and I didn't. We'll argue about something else that doesn't matter. The specifics at this point are irrelevant. Our relationship has become a power struggle. Upon our return from Fredericksburg, the trip we so hoped would fix our relationship, we struggle against the force of Kiki's friends and family, most of whom are rooting against us now that they know the truth. We talk about my memoir on and off and get triggered by it every time. Kiki wants me to focus on our relationship, and I refuse to see my memoir as something that opposes it. She cries and I get angry. She reminds me that it wasn't that long ago that I cheated and that it still hurts, and I conflate her processing of those emotions with her trying to keep me boxed into who I used to be, because I've changed, haven't I? I'm no longer the person that I wrote about in my memoir, am I? The signs are all there, but we both choose to ignore them. In the springtime, we start going for walks on a trail we discovered near my apartment, one we drove by many times before, but never stopped arguing to notice. During one of these walks, I tell Kiki that maybe our plan to move in together can wait another year. Yes, she says. I was thinking the same thing. It seems kind of rushed to do it this lease cycle. She stops, and I can tell she's deciding whether or not to speak her mind. Finally, she says, I also think it would be good for us to go on trips alone. We were so stressed trying to make Mexico City happen for both of us. But there's no reason I can't join you next time around. Oh, yeah, I say. I try not to question what it means about our relationship that we're so relieved to know we don't have to travel together anytime soon, but unfailingly, I do. Kiki notices the look on my face and says, but that's not a bad thing. It'll be good for us to learn to spend some time away from each other. You're right, I say. While we're on the topic of Mexico, I've been meaning to tell you that I want to try DMT with my friends. I see anxiety seep into Kiki's being. She doesn't like what I've said. Before she says a word, I start planning my defense. Would that bother you? I guess I'm just worried about you being in a social environment with less control over your actions. Will there be any girls there? Oh, no. Unless it's one of their girlfriends, I doubt there will be any girls. Besides, DMT isn't a social drug. From what I've heard, it completely knocks you out. Why do you want to do that? She asks. I don't know. It's just like something I do with that group of friends. I'm curious about the experience. What's so wrong with that? Nothing, Kiki says. I'm just asking you a question. We walk a while longer and then decide to turn around. I need a break, Kiki says. Can we sit down for a sec? Of course, I say. We sit on a bench overlooking the river. There's an emptiness that permeates the space we're sharing. We're trying to enjoy each other's company, trying to give this a shot, but we can't seem to get out of our own way. You didn't feel anything for her, did you? Kiki finally asks. I'm taken aback by the question. I say, no. She was just a means to an end. I'm sorry. I don't mean to bring this up now, she says, tears forming in her eyes. Hey, I put my arm around her. Come here. It's okay. When you say a means to an end, I mean I just wanted to escape from my pain through sex. But you said you didn't have sex with her. No, I didn't. You said you tried to, but then you got sick. Well, yeah, that's what I mean. We stopped 5 seconds into it so that I could vomit. I feel Kiki's heart break all over again and wonder if, when I initially confessed, I kept my descriptions vague to protect her or myself. Passers-by on the hike and bike trail look at us as Kiki starts to cry. Did you use protection? I choke on my own spit. I take a deep breath and avoid Kiki's eyes and then say, no, I didn't. There is no world I can imagine where Kiki tells me the same thing and I don't hate her for the rest of my life. There is no bigger way to shatter someone's trust. When the words come out of my mouth, I feel her pain, but also the same sense of surrender I felt the last time I confessed. Does she still see me the same way she did that first night at Buzzmill? How could she? Why didn't you tell me any of this? I didn't think it was my place to describe every detail to you. When I said we tried, I thought that was clear. I'm sorry that it wasn't. My intention wasn't to hide anything from you. I told you I'm done lying, and I meant it. I believe you, she says. This just really hurts. A few weeks later, she comes over before one of my improv shows and holds me as I weep. Trying to heal myself and fix the relationship at the same time feels impossible. Kiki is slipping from my life, and crying feels like it's speeding that up. I apologize to her for my tears, but she insists that it's okay. She asks why I'm crying. No emotion in her face, almost like she's asking for someone else. I tell her I'm not sure. You don't look like you care, I say. Of course I care. I'm just exhausted, Nick. This is a lot for me right now. I get up and lock myself in the bathroom. I cry with my back against the door for some time. When I come out, I've put up my walls. Kiki asks how I'm doing. I'm fine. She drops the act and says, "Can we not do this right now?" Do what? I ask. Can we not fight? I can't keep doing this. Keep doing this? I say. You want to break up with me? Is that what you're saying? She's silent, and that's all I need to finally listen to her. Oh no, I say. No, no, no. You do? She bursts into tears and says, I just can't keep doing this, Nick. I can't sleep most nights. I'm anxious at work all the time. This isn't healthy anymore. I fall to the ground and cry next to her. I know she's right and that it was only a matter of time. I just didn't know that time was tonight. But we're trying, honey. We're not perfect. Nobody is. This is far from perfect. I'm sorry, Nick. She tenses up as her face turns red. This isn't happening. I can still salvage it. My face melts with expressions of pain I didn't know I was capable of. I hear the front door open, and my brother come inside at the worst possible time. What seems like an hour goes by, and neither of us moves an inch, paralyzed by fear and anxiety. The moment is finally here, but we're not ready for it. I go back and forth between begging her to take me back and accepting what she wants. You're right, I say. This has been really hard. I still want to be with you, but I love you, Kiki, and I want the best for you. If that means I need to let you go, I will. I don't know if that's what's best for me, she says. Then let's keep doing the work, honey. This doesn't have to end tonight. You have no idea how much I want that. But you have no idea how much I don't. Nothing's ever felt this intense. I look at her and tell her I love her. We kiss and lie down and rub our bodies together, afraid we'll never get the opportunity to again. Before I reach for a condom, We look at each other approvingly. Then we undress and make love gently. Every emotional block completely vanishes. It's sex in its purest, rawest expression. We cry during and after it. We stay locked in embrace, but we know after we release the sexual energy that it's over. Things will never be the same. Night falls and Kiki says, "I should go home, but I don't want to. You can spend the night." "I can't. I would have such a hard time leaving in the morning." "You're having a hard time leaving right now." "Because I'm not sure of this decision," she says. "Please don't be upset if it's the wrong one." "I'm not upset at you, Kiki. You're doing what you think is best for you." "I don't know that this is what's best for me. I just need some time. If it feels wrong, we'll know and we can talk about it then. But we need to try this. We both need this." I hear a glimmer of hope that we might possibly be together again someday. Does this mean we aren't saying goodbye, but rather see you later? We kiss and get dressed. I cry again as I watch Kiki pack up her things one last time. Every loving moment we ever shared flashes before my eyes. Every embrace, every I love you, every orgasm, every fight we made up from. Every time she told me I was smart. The first time we kissed. The first time we held hands. The night her cat bit my knee. The showers we took together. The poems we wrote. The songs we listened to. The movies we watched. The sleepless nights. The pictures we texted each other. The trip to Mexico. The trip to Charlottesville. The trip to Marfa. The nights we got high with her little brother and talked about music. The way she furrowed her brows when she was in deep thought. The way she played with Ellie. All gone. Now only a reminder of what once was. We walk to the front door. I open it and Kiki walks out. She turns around and kisses me and hugs me and looks at me like a scared child. "I love you, Nick." "I love you too, Kiki." "I'll always be there if you need anyone." "So will I." "I'm scared." "I'm scared too." "Okay, I'm gonna go now." "Okay." She turns around and walks down a flight of stairs. She stops to look at me. Every part of me wants to run down and kiss her one last time. But I don't. I sit atop the flight of stairs she just went down and watch as she gets in her car and drives away, tears streaming down my face over trails of older, dried up tears I didn't wipe off. I go back to my room. Despite how dreamlike it all seems, nothing has ever felt more real than this. I look for the drop of paint Kiki spilled on my carpet floor many months ago and feel an emotional upheaval when I find it. My cries become visceral. The world around me feels like it's crumbling to pieces. I crawl into bed, get in the fetal position, and cry for hours until I fall asleep. Chapter 29. Heartbroken. The world doesn't stop for you when you're heartbroken. Your rent is still due on the first of the month and you're still expected to clock into work on time. The one thing that needs you to stop is your body. If you don't, sometimes it'll stop the world for you. I spend the first week after the breakup holding on to hope that Kiki will message me, even if only to tell me that she isn't going to change her mind. I tell myself the breakup isn't final until I hear from her one last time. I try to rationalize my way out of feeling sad and alone, but fail. I cry more in 1 week than I had in the last 5 years. The next 2 weeks are hell, if hell means being surrounded by people whose love I have a hard time accepting. I look everywhere but inward for comfort because my self-esteem is non-existent. Work is the hardest place to cry at. I'm new at my restaurant job and work with all men. I go into my first shift like a ghost. I'm there, but everyone can see through me. I take a woman's order, and when I hand it to her 5 minutes later, she says, "Long day, huh?" As if the emotional landscape the bags under my eyes carry can be boiled down to a hard day's work. I want to cry in front of her, but I suppress it. Then I go to the bathroom and sob as quietly as I can until my body becomes numb enough that I feel I can go back outside. My manager, Kyle, finds me in the dish pit and asks how I'm doing. "Not great," I say. "Something going on?" he asks. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." "I was broken up with." There's a pause I'm all too familiar with. A pause that in the past has indicated to me that I've overshared. Neither of us looks the other in the eyes. Then he says, "Bitches, huh?" At home I find reminders of Kiki and everything I do, each one warping time in my head, as if staring at a birthday card from her can take me back to another miserable time, only this one with her by my side. There's a paper squirrel we crafted together and a handwritten poem about the first morning that we woke up together, both pinned to the wall next to my bed. There are all of my extra-large t-shirts she liked to wear to bed, her toothbrush next to mine, and my floor covered in dog hair from all the times we let Ellie in the room so the two of them could bond. When I shower, I try only to face the shower head because turning my body the other way brings her in there with me. It pains me to think that I'll never watch her smile under hot water again or be able to rub soap on her back. We'd started spending so much time together that even my Thai chicken recipe feels impossible to cook again. Not without her there to say, and "ah," and "I've been thinking about this all week long. I'm so happy we're eating it." Anytime I break down, I text my two best friends and ask for support. It helps in the way I imagine suicide hotlines help people with bigger problems than mine. It doesn't fix anything, but it shows me that I still matter to someone. I also seek out my brother. He's seen me cry before, but never like this. As he holds me, I'm filled with self-loathing thoughts. I am a burden to him. I am weak, and whether or not he admits it now, surely he'll remind me of it at a later date. By week 4, I regain some of my courage and decide to fly to Las Vegas to play in the World Series of Poker. I make this decision at 2 in the morning on a sleepless night. I need a distraction, and for 3 nights, I find it. I force myself into crowded isolation where nobody matters, and thus the whole idea of worth becomes irrelevant. I play poker, do drugs, and eat terrible food. I discover that Craigslist no longer offers a personals section. There's a new site, Double List, supplying where there is demand. I create an account and message back and forth with several men. They all ask to fuck me in the ass. I tell them I only do blowjobs. Most of them stop responding. 3 of them ask how much I charge for that. I make up a number so outrageous that I know they won't accept. Only 1 of them responds. "Go fuck yourself, LOL. When I return, I find that the pain I'm running from is still there, so I find other distractions in women and weed. I smoke morning, day, and night. I'm high 24/7. The few dates I go on are terrible. I am a shell of myself, trying to put on an act for women I have no interest in connecting with, but instead only want to use to escape from my reality. During all of this, I continue to see my therapist, Javier, and even cry on his shoulder once. Only after enough rejections and wasted therapy sessions do I come back to my grief. It's something I hear on a podcast that reminds me of the work I have ahead of me. It goes something like this. You can run from things that hurt. You most definitely can. but eventually that shit catches up to you. Learning to feel your emotions is the only way to heal. I decide that I want that. I want to heal. Book 2. Healing. Chapter 30. Support Groups. At its core, codependency is the inability to feel and express my emotions out of fear that my partner might reject me if I do. I first identified as a codependent during my freshman year of college. I was 19 and almost through my first semester. My parents constantly reminded me not to waste this opportunity because of how expensive it was for them. In an attempt to help them pay for tuition, I entered different writing contests and scholarships. One was for a rehab center in the Malibu area. The prompt was simple. Write about an addiction you have struggled with for years. I wrote about my codependent relationship with Valentina, not entirely sure whether or not that qualified as an addiction. I finished third and won a $1,500 scholarship for next semester. Something I wrote in under 1 hour had netted me $1,500. This was the first time I'd made money from my writing, and the first time I published something about my real life. I shared the news with my mom and dad. My dad reminded me that $1,500 wasn't enough to raise a family. My mom just said, "That's great, honey. Congratulations," and then asked me about the rest of my day. I had hit the target they laid out for me and helped with some financial aid, but they didn't care. They just set new targets for me. Sometimes family isn't where you start. When Kiki broke up with me, I let family and friends know, but I didn't open myself up to them. An anonymous support group felt like the only place for me to do that. My first Codependence Anonymous meeting started a minute early. I only noticed this because there weren't enough of us in the room to make me feel like a ghost, which is the only time I ever feel comfortable being myself. I sat next to a woman that looked to be my mother's age, same skin deterioration and hair color, and across from a younger girl that looked to be my age, caramel skin and a light brush of hair on her arms. In the back corner of the room was John, who looked older than everyone else and moved like he knew things others didn't. "Do you want to lead today, Cindy?" he asked the older woman to my left. Cindy shook her head and laughed, then said, "I'm in no place to lead this today." "That's all right," John said, and sat to my right. As we went through the opening preamble and introductions, more people arrived and took their seats. I could see the Austin skyline miles away, through the panoramic window that, to my surprise, some had chosen to sit facing away from. There it was, the city where Kiki and I had fallen in love. I thought about how empty it looked from far away, surrounded by dense Texas trees. I searched for memories I had made in it prior to meeting her, but my wound was too fresh. So I looked away and wondered if this was why some chose to sit with their backs facing it. By the time we got to the sharing portion of the meeting, there must have been 10 of us altogether. Aside from Gina, the only other young adult, everyone looked over 40. I felt guilty and relieved, knowing I was half as old as them, that I still had my whole life ahead of me. I listened to people talk about failed marriages that lasted longer than I'd been alive. Marriages they never felt satisfied with, but always stayed in, hoping to make them work. Igor left his wife and kids in Kentucky to get their life started in Austin, but once he'd made the move, his wife had started to have second thoughts, to suggest the idea of separation. She fell in love with the single me, and I guess that when I get into relationships, I become a different person. I hand over all of my power to her. Holy shit, I thought. He just described me. My whole identity was tied to being a husband and a father. I've been here for a few weeks now. without my family. And I'm realizing that I don't even know what it is that I like anymore. Saul talked about growing up bullied and how that still affected him in his old age. He was always on edge, expecting someone to attack him. He saw events with large groups of people, like concerts, as less than. I wonder sometimes if that's why so many people have basic relationships. Is music all they have in common? Gina opened up about her past relationship and how abusive it was, how it affected her ability to trust others. She teared up at one point and said, "I know how damaging that is to the people around me, and I can't help but feel angry at my ex because of it. I felt like I was in a room with 9 other versions of me. I also turn over all of my confidence to women as soon as I enter into romantic relationships with them. I lose myself in the identity of being someone else's partner so much that I often forget who I was before that. In social interactions, I feel as though everyone is waiting for me to make a mistake or say something stupid. And despite my ego telling me otherwise, I see the ways in which I have been abusive to women and the ways that women have been abusive to me." When Gina was done speaking, my body began to tremble. Is it my turn to speak? What if I don't speak? Does that mean that this isn't for me? What about the others who haven't spoken either? Am I being selfish if I take up time they could have used instead? Who, at the end of the day, gives a flying fuck what a 23-year-old kid has to say? In the end, I took a chance and told them my story. After the meeting, John handed me my first-timer chip. Inscribed on the back of it was the foundational message of all recovery meetings. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. I met Mo at CODA, Codependence Anonymous. He had silver hair and looked like an actor researching a role. He was depressed, and he didn't hide it. He seldom shared during the meetings, but when he did, he always cried. He'd been going through a breakup just like mine, one he didn't initiate. He said the breakup had put a stop to his art. He didn't know what there was left to live for, and I could relate to that. We rode the elevator down together, and I asked him what kind of art he made. "I paint some stuff," he said, "and I've written a few songs." A depressed, broken-hearted painter and musician, all things I romanticized as a teenager, but there was nothing romantic about the look on Mo's face. "You're a writer too, aren't you?" he said. "I am," I said. "Would you feel comfortable sharing any of your stuff with me?" A surprised look formed on his face. He smiled and said, "Yeah, I'd be okay with that." We exchanged phone numbers on the way out and talked some more about the kinds of therapies we were pursuing outside of this meeting. Mo was interested in my mention of ketamine infusions. He told me he was doing EMDR and asked if the two were similar. I explained to him that I had never tried EMDR and was yet to start my ketamine infusions. Then we said goodbye. Later that night, I received a text message from Mo with an audio clip and 2 pictures of his paintings. I cried when I listened to the song. I could hear Mo's pain in it. His paintings reminded me of early Van Gogh. He asked if he could read my memoir. The following week, I brought him a copy. Then, a couple weeks after that, he texted to tell me he loved it. A grown, silver-haired man who looked like he had been through hell and back messaged me to tell me that my story resonated with him. I never committed to my meetings enough to find a sponsor. The idea of being held accountable by another broken man challenged my ego. I didn't believe it would help me, both in my CODA and later in my HOR Heart of Recovery meetings. The opportunity would present itself numerous times. Every time, I passed on the offer. I was afraid of committing. of accepting that I wasn't the smartest person in the group, of accepting that the way this broken individual can help others by sharing his story, there are other broken individuals that can help me too. But that didn't stop me from learning important lessons. Coda showed me that there were others like me willing to be brave and share their story. It gave me a space to learn how to share mine. From Coda, I learned that age is just an excuse I use to not do the work. Most of the men and women in the group were much older than me, and every week there was a new face, also older, that believed change was possible. I learned that no matter how close I am to the people in my life, sometimes it can be hard to open up to them. But at meetings, nobody can break my trust because nobody knows who I am. If all else failed, I knew that at least here, someone would always listen. Not only that, but I offered the same to everyone else. Even when I felt like absolute shit and didn't want to be there, I knew that my presence alone created an impact in others. At a time when, in Mo's words, I didn't know what there was left to live for, being of service to others gave me purpose. I transitioned out of Coda and joined Heart of Recovery because after a while I realized there was no forward momentum at Coda. Everyone came in to report mostly the same things week in and week out, but nobody did anything about it. The lessons at HOR were similar. My connection to the group much stronger. At this meeting, there was no single thing I had to identify as. That I was recovering mattered more than what I was recovering from. There were alcoholics, drug addicts, people my age that just felt like their lives were falling apart. And me, the codependent. Meetings started with a 20-minute meditation followed by a 10-minute reading. They ended with 30 minutes of open sharing. Unlike at Coda, here it felt like people had their shit together. I felt the anonymity less. After our meetings, we went out to dinner until early bedtimes called people home. Over the course of 6 months, I developed a ton of relationships in the group. I met a woman from South America and her husband, both of whom understood my culture. I met a single man who adopted a rowdy dog he was struggling with. He reflected back to me my perfectionist shadow. I met Mona, an older woman with gray hair, a veteran of HOR who had lived through the Beatles era and once seen Led Zeppelin live before they were rocking out arenas. She understood my burning desire to be a part of something greater than myself. Eventually, I outgrew both meetings, which is possible. During my stints in them, I witnessed pain on a scale I never had before. The groups proved to me that there are others out there with a desire to heal. Going to groups, I no longer felt that I was alone. Chapter 31. Choosing myself. Letting go of what's familiar is hard. It requires a degree of uncertainty in my life, and for me to stand up to people I may never have stood up to otherwise. By people, I mostly mean family. I have yet to meet someone without trauma tied to their parents. Some parents embrace a child's willingness to heal from said trauma. Others fear the ever-living hell out of it. And the latter is why so many people decide to stop doing the work. When mom and dad tell us that we're hurting them, it can seem impossible to keep going. But are we really the ones hurting them? Are we responsible for how our parents feel? Or are our parents so afraid of not having someone to take care of, control, that they see our desire to heal as a threat to that dynamic? If someone we loved was trying to heal so they could become a better person, would our first priority be to think of how that's going to affect us? Some have such a deep desire to protect their parents that they never ask these questions in the first place. Understanding where that desire comes from has helped me give it less weight. My desire to protect my parents is actually my desire to protect myself from their rejection. The reason it's so deeply rooted is because as a kid, I depended on my parents. Back then, rejection quite literally meant death, because I wasn't capable of depending on myself yet. To paraphrase Gabor Mate, rejection would have created an unsolvable problem, and protecting them and myself was my solution to that problem. Knowing that, I was able to reframe my present situation and see that their rejection no longer means death because I no longer depend on them. This gives me clarity from trauma. I may still feel like healing myself, and hurting them in the process will be the death of me, but that feeling is only there to inform me of two things: that this is a wound from the past, and that it only holds truth in the present if I choose to let it. Healing does not mean going to therapy, doing yoga, meditating, writing, or any other activity. Those are just tools. Healing is when I choose to confront things that generation after generation in my family ignored out of fear. I don't say that to put them down. I say it because that fear gets passed down and is one of the reasons it can feel overwhelming to start. Choosing to heal is like an immigrant choosing to leave his country in the hopes that his children will have a better life than him. There are no guarantees he'll succeed, no easy ways out, and often only a handful of people to support him along the way. Healing started with choosing myself. Even now, years after I started, many of my family and friends still don't understand what I'm doing and why I can't be a little quieter about it. They have doubted me, said hurtful things to me, tried to control me, or simply ignored me. This doesn't mean they don't love me or that I don't love them. Love can't be tampered with. Love just is. But in some cases, love needs to exist at a distance. Just listen. Before I published my first memoir, I shared my truth with loved ones because I didn't want them to learn about me from a book or a blog post. I wanted to be there to answer their questions. My thought was that by doing that, it would be easier for them to process. The truth is that I wanted to control the outcome. I was afraid they wouldn't like what they would learn. My unconscious goal was to prevent that. I could have shared my story any way I wanted to, and there would have been nothing wrong with that because it's my story. I saved my mom and sister for last, and my dad I wasn't really sure if or when I would ever talk to about it. When I told Mom, she read the memoir in one sitting. I told her that I had a really painful childhood. I told her about moving back to Cancun to live with Dad and what that was like for me, how I started chatting with perverts online, and what that eventually led me to in the real world. I told her everything. At first, she understood. "It actually makes a lot of sense to me," she said. "How can I help?" "You're doing it right now," I said. "I just need you to listen." I could tell that answer didn't satisfy her caretaking needs. She didn't trust that I could handle this on my own. She never has. For most of my life, both her and Dad tried to shelter and protect me. They thought that was what was best for me. Unconsciously, what Mom didn't know was that this behavior originated in her fear of losing me, of not being needed anymore. In an ideal world, children go from needing their parents to wanting them. When a child doesn't learn to take care of himself, he needs his parents forever. When he does, he wants his parents forever because they are a source of unconditional love. What happened with me was a little bit of both and a little bit of neither. I wanted my parents around because they generally never were. I also wanted them gone because having them around was painful. Eventually, Mom struggled to accept my decision. She saw writing the book as one thing, but publishing it as another. A couple weeks after she read it, we had a much different conversation. "I'm worried that you might have some kind of relapse if everyone finds out about this. People on the internet can be mean. Are you sure it's the best idea to publish this?" Though I'm not sure she did it consciously, This was a form of gaslighting. At her core, my mom was afraid of what others would think of her if this was who her child was. She was afraid of not having control over her own image, of feeling helpless. 2 weeks before it was published, I called her to wish her a happy birthday. She was somewhere crowded when she answered. "Hi, Mom. Happy birthday," I said. "Are you busy?" "We're having a small celebration. Is it all right if I call you back?" "Of course," I said. "I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday." "Thanks." "All right, talk to you later." "Wait," she said. There was silence. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, why?" "Are you sure? You feel mentally stable? The stuff you're posting online is alarming." "Alarming," I said. "You've read the book. They're just excerpts from it. It's not normal to post that kind of stuff. Are you upset? Do you think medication would help?" "All right," I said. "Goodbye, Mom." I didn't speak to her for over 2 years after that phone call. Who is this going to help? Growing up was hard for me and my siblings. We each suffered for different reasons. I was born after Mom started hating Dad. I didn't get to experience the few years that they shared some modicum of happiness. Todd was the middle child. His experience never mattered because Mom and Dad were too busy with Juliana and me. And Juliana was involved in Dad's infidelity in ways that no child should ever be. Though I don't actually compare, if I had to, I would say Juliana had it worst. I remember the shouting matches between Mom and her. I remember Mom didn't trust Juliana and talked about her like she was a villain. Dad talked about her like she was an employee he wanted to fire. And if my year in the Bay Area pulled me into depression, I can't imagine what Juliana's year in boarding school did to her. I could write a whole book about her. The thing is that if I did, she'd tell you none of it was true. When I opened up to her about my life, she wasn't curious to know more. She was uncomfortable. I told her the same thing I told Mom. You don't have to read the book if you don't want to. I just wanted us to have a conversation about it before I publish it. You shouldn't publish it, she said. There aren't as many people like you as you think there are. Who is this going to help? Our call didn't end as abruptly as the one with Mom did, but for 2 years after that, I didn't speak to her either. The shift. In the time since I wrote this, I tried to reopen a dialogue with both of them. I believe I was only able to do this once I learned to love them despite their actions. I'm not quite sure that I've forgiven them, only because I don't think they did anything wrong. Trauma is not about right or wrong. Though communication between us is open again, they are by no means a strong presence in my life. They carry a lot of the same wounds, and I hold strong boundaries with them because of that. Cutting ties with them wasn't easy. I used to cry when I thought of how much separation still exists between us. However, when I look at where my life was when they were still a big part of it, and where I am now, I have no regrets. I can heal my relationship to others, whether or not they are involved in the process. Where I grew up, family is everything, in theory. Mexican men especially like to tell me that you never turn your back on your mother. You owe her your life for bringing you into this world. I know a lot of people that feel this way. Most of them are unhappy because they're living the lives their parents want them to. I've met dozens of men and women whose parents don't approve of their partners because of the color of their skin. I've dated women who feel suffocated by their mother's religious beliefs. Women who are met with, "Only the Lord can help you," when they ask for support. I have friends that drink when they get off the phone with their parents because they feel drained. Friends that have told me stories of those same parents beating them when they were younger. and these are the parents they feel obligated to keep in their lives, and often even take care of. I'm no one to tell them they shouldn't, but I know from experience that the more distance I keep between myself and a toxic person, the healthier I am, and the more I can help those around me. Haters. As I shared more of my truth publicly, people came out of the woodworks to let me know how they felt about it. Surprisingly, none of it came from strangers on the internet, like my mom feared. Every single person that hated on me was someone I considered family. I put the word hated in quotations because I've learned that none of these people actually hate me. They simply can't bear to do their own work and find it difficult to be happy for those who can. In other words, when someone tries to put me down for who I am or what I'm doing with my life, it's a reflection of how they feel about themselves and has nothing to do with me. The best example of this came in a 10-paragraph message sent to me on my birthday by my childhood nanny, redacted. I was filled with rage when I listened to your truth because it was filled with lies and hate. You forgot to include me in your story, but I guess it's because you don't care about me. You don't know what it's like to have bad parents. I do. I think the biggest mistake your parents made was that they didn't beat the fuck out of you and your sister. I must confess I wanted to do it for them many times. Your story isn't helping anyone. It's depressing. Toxic work environments. Having worked in the food service industry for over 6 years, I know firsthand what it's like to be in a toxic workplace. I also know it's not just the food service industry. No matter the line of work I'm in, someone in it hates their job. So many friends have told me they are that person. If I'm unsure about whether or not I'm that person, I look for these signs. I'd rather not see my coworkers outside of work. I only talk about work with my coworkers. I mostly talk about work with people outside of work. I don't feel valued at my job. I secretly fantasize about never going back to my job. I often feel unhappy at work, but invalidate my feelings by saying things like, "But the benefits are so good," or "Most people would kill to have my job." My job and my personal life are not two separate things. If I hold certain values and beliefs in my personal life but find that I compromise on them at work, that shit's not gonna last. And if it does, it's only going to hurt me. This was most prevalent for me when I worked at a restaurant in downtown Austin. Reem and I were the assistant general managers, and Dave was our GM. Below us on the bullshit restaurant hierarchy was one of my friends, Phil. Reem disliked me, but always chose to communicate that passive-aggressively. He didn't know how to regulate his emotions and often got in arguments with customers and employees. One day, Phil and I opened together. At midday, I left and Phil stayed a while longer. Phil and I hadn't finished 100% of our duties because of how busy it had been. Reem arrived for his night shift and found the few duties we hadn't finished. He proceeded to get in an argument with Phil. "You're fucking fat and lazy," Reem told Phil. "Your girlfriend's fat and lazy too." Phil told Reem he wasn't going to tolerate this behavior and went to clock out. "You're a fucking faggot," Reem said. "Get the fuck out of here." Dave was there to witness it all, and he did nothing about it. Phil reached out to me that night and told me he'd been crying from when he left work until he reached out to me. He said he was afraid to go back to work. I tried to help Phil, but ultimately, he decided to brush this under the rug. So I spoke to Dave about it. "Reem wasn't the only one saying mean things," Dave said. "Was he the only one that used the word faggot?" I asked. Dave nodded yes. "Was he the one in the managerial position?" Dave nodded yes again. I know, he said. "It's just not easy to hire someone right now." We were 3 months into the COVID-19 lockdowns. Everyone was looking for work. I felt that Dave was ultimately saying, This happened once, and it can happen again. From the day I found out about what happened to the day that I quit, I felt sick to my stomach working there. Reem wasn't the only one who had hurt Phil. We all had. We were all a part of setting this precedent, and that went directly against my values. I rationalized the events for a couple of weeks and told myself it was risky to quit my job during the lockdowns. I was making good money. My bike ride was short. My gym was close to work. I tried to see this as something other than what it was. But eventually, I quit. And as soon as I did, I felt in my gut that I had made the right decision. I felt secure enough in myself to take a risk and pursue a more meaningful life. Meaning comes from the decisions I make on a daily basis that inform my relationship to myself. Chapter 32. Lessons from Dating. I didn't date for 2 months after the breakup. I knew it would only distract me from grieving, and that seemed like the more important thing to do. In the past, I'd gone from one relationship to another, leaving no time in between to be with myself. This time, there was no woman waiting for me after Kiki. There was only pain from having lost Kiki, on top of pain I never felt when I lost my 2 girlfriends before her. That's right. Because I hadn't grieved my first 2 relationships, that grief came back the 3rd time around. Only now, it had grown exponentially. It felt impossible to get over her. Most guys I have talked to about breakups say the same thing. Having grown up with conditional love, longing for my mom to accept me, losing a romantic partner felt like the end of the world. It reminded me of the pain I endured as a kid when I felt rejected by my mom. After 2 months, I noticed my grief had shifted. I still thought about Kiki every day, still looked at old pictures of us together to feel connected to her, and I still cried. But I could go to work without feeling hollow inside. I could spend time with friends and not feel like those interactions were meaningless. I saw a sliver of hope far off in the distance, and mistakenly, I thought this meant I was ready to date again. Betty. It took me 5 first dates to get to a second one. Her name was Betty. She had long blonde hair, tattooed arms, and a grace about her that Kiki didn't. She was new to Austin and had few friends. She welcomed me into her life with open arms. After a few dates, this feeling started to sink in that I wasn't supposed to be dating her. Externally, everything was going well, but one day, after we watched a movie together and were driving back to my apartment, I felt gross. I felt uncomfortable that we'd started holding hands and kissing in public, even though I loved doing those things. It still felt like cheating on Kiki. During an outdoor play we attended, I completely lost my ability to pretend. It was hot and my skin had started to itch. I didn't want to be there. Betty asked what was wrong. "I don't know," I said. "We've been out here for an hour and the play hasn't even started. Do you want to do something else?" "It's okay." "No," she said. "I'm kind of hot too. Let's go." We got up and walked to her car. She asked me what I wanted to do. I froze. "Do you want to go to your place? We can listen to music together." "Sure," I said. "Let's do that." When we got there, we sat on my bedroom floor, our backs against my bed, got high, and listened to music. I momentarily felt better. Then the paranoia kicked in. She knows you're just escaping. She thinks you're a deadbeat drug addict. We kissed and then had sex. It was physically uncomfortable. It was my first time being with someone since Kiki. I was as emotionally disconnected from the act as I've ever been. After that, Betty went home. I felt bad. I wanted her to know it wasn't about her, that I was going through a rough time. She texted me that night to tell me she didn't want to see me anymore. Shannon. Because of the way things ended with Betty, I knew I didn't ever want to put anyone else through that. I told myself that from now on I would be honest with the women I dated. Shannon was a third-grade teacher. On our third date, she decided to let me know she had discovered my memoir on Amazon and ordered a copy. She didn't seem judgmental about it, so on our fourth date, she showed up with her copy and questions. After she grilled me, the only thing I asked her was, "So you don't care that I've been with men?" "That's whatever," she said. "What was harder for me to read was when you were with girls." "What? Why?" "Well, because we've slept together. It's harder to think about you with other women now." The next time I saw her, she came over to my place to drop off homemade brownies for my birthday. Things were a little more serious, but I had told myself, and my therapist, that my intention was to keep things casual with all women for now. I was at her place when I told her this. I said, "I like you a lot, and I'm really enjoying the time we spend together, but I'm not quite ready for anything beyond that." "Ever?" she said. "To be honest, I don't know." "Okay," she finally said. "I don't know how I feel about that. I'm going to think about it." This was probably one of the first times in my life that I told a woman I actually liked that I wasn't looking for anything serious. It was fucking hard. She was a loving woman, and she had accepted me, flaws and all. When I published the memoir, I wasn't sure I would ever find someone like her. Now I had that and was making a conscious choice to potentially lose it. I chose this so I could learn to see abundance rather than scarcity. I entered my last two relationships because I saw love as scarce and didn't want to lose what little of it I had. Now I was learning that even if external love is scarce, which it isn't, internal love is abundant. Before I told her, I feared how Shannon would react and how I would feel afterward. What if she rejects me? What if she attacks the memoir? What if I never find another woman like her? A week after I told her, she invited me out for drinks and ended things. It wasn't pretty. She was really upset. When we arrived outside my apartment, she got out of the car and hugged me, tears still in her eyes. Her cursing had stopped, but her cries had not. I told her I was sorry and walked away. And to my surprise, I felt better about myself, not worse. Jordan. Jordan told me on our first date that she wasn't looking for anything serious, and definitely nothing monogamous. As soon as she said it, I felt safe enough to share that I was looking for the same. It's one of those things that you're just not taught as a man. I always believed that I had to be someone I wasn't in order to have sex with women. That's how I ended up in monogamous relationships I didn't want to be in. I wanted to have sex, and I thought if I told those women that I wasn't ready for a relationship, they wouldn't want to. So I lied. To them and to myself. Jordan and I went on 4 dates after that and had clunky, awkward sex each time. To give you an idea of how disconnected we were, the first time we slept together, I didn't wear a condom and I finished inside her, only to find out the next time I saw her and was about to do the same thing, that she wasn't on birth control and had taken a morning after pill. I was scared to ask if she was on it, and she was scared to set a boundary, so we just didn't say anything at all. We got along and laughed a lot, but the sex felt empty because it was devoid of any emotional connection. We were both trying to fill a hole we hadn't even acknowledged was there yet. It's a sad image for me to admit I was a part of. I chose to put myself through it, and have done so many times in the past because I didn't know it was okay not to enjoy casual sex. All men want is to go out to bars and clubs and find random hot women to sleep with and never talk to again, right? You're only as good as the women you've had one-night stands with, right? That was the programming I received up to my early 20s. It's still the programming that dominates Western society. I just choose not to consume it anymore. Casual sex is nothing more than a distraction from my emotions. I've always preferred deep emotional connection over casual flings. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that and became preoccupied with others' expectations. Being with Jordan was the first time I realized I don't actually enjoy casual sex and that it never fixes any of my problems. Unless I'm running from something, there is no upside to having sex with someone I don't want to talk to as soon as the sex is over. Even if I am running, that race has no finish line. It ends when I realize I've been running in place the whole time. Mary. When things go south with a woman, my default is to think that I did something wrong, that it's my fault. If it's not something I did, it must be something I am. At times, this mindset has helped me to grow, but mostly what it does is make me feel like shit about myself. Mary was a couple years younger than me, blonde, tall, and could talk a lot of game about psychotherapy. She was open about her traumas and receptive to mine. I was hooked, and far enough from my breakup with Kiki that I thought this could become serious. She told me her mom was an alcoholic and her dad a workaholic. She said she'd just gotten out of a 5-year relationship. But I've moved on, she insisted. I ignored all of this because to acknowledge it would have meant to let go and move on from her. Then we had sex. She orgasmed and became a puddle of tears immediately afterward. "I'm sorry," she said. "It happens sometimes. I'm okay. It has nothing to do with you." "Are you sure you're all right?" "Yeah, I think it's just because I really like you." "Oh, well, I really like you too," I said. We kissed and got out of bed. She said it was getting late and that she needed to leave. "You could spend the night," I offered. "No, I don't sleep well in other people's beds." When we said goodbye, we made tentative plans to see each other soon, and after that night, I never saw her again. She didn't fully ghost me. She just gradually stopped texting me. It never came directly from her, but after enough conversations about it in therapy, it became obvious to me that this had nothing to do with me. I was the rebound. Mary was still in a raw emotional state from her past relationship, and I had chosen to believe she could heal from a 5-year relationship in 1 month. All the signs were there. I just didn't want to accept them. Shifting my focus allowed me to learn the more important lesson here. Rather than obsessing over what I could have done differently, what mattered was that I trust my gut more in the future. With this perspective, I realized I hadn't missed an opportunity. I had dodged a bullet. Nora. Up to the age of 23, the pattern in my life had been to find women that appeared vulnerable and attached to them so that I could try to fix them. I was familiar with that dynamic because I played that role for my own mother. She was in pain before I was even born, and I was the baby that was supposed to fix that. This concept is talked about at length in psychology books. It says that unresolved trauma will have us confuse familiar behaviors as sexual attraction. Part of healing that trauma means making different decisions than the familiar ones I'm used to. It's a process that reappears every time I go on a date with a woman. It can be as simple as choosing to end the date very early on if I've made my mind up instead of staying for hours to protect her feelings. Or it can be as complex as it was with Nora. It started on our first date when she told me she had been raped. I decided to continue seeing her because unconsciously I recognized that she was vulnerable, and trying to fix her was easier than trying to fix myself. The pattern was familiar. The next 2 dates weren't any better. My gut was telling me to stop, but I kept going through the motions. I did all the things I do when I want to court a woman. I rationalized my way into thinking that maybe developing feelings for someone can take time. And maybe it does sometimes, but this clearly wasn't one of those times. After the third date, we got into a routine. She came over to my apartment, we talked about her rape, her eating disorder, and her abusive mother, and then made each other orgasm. Then she went home feeling great about the night, and I went to sleep feeling like a fraud. I always invited her over after work because I didn't want to deal with how much I hated my job. Instead of getting high after work like I used to do, now I had her to distract myself with. Finally, one day I woke up and told myself today would be the day I ended things. I drafted a text I was going to send her. She texted me right before I sent it and asked if I wanted to see her that night. I deleted the text and invited her over. She came over, we talked, she gave me a blowjob, we cuddled, and then she went home. When she left, that text entered my mind again. Tomorrow morning, I told myself, and to my surprise, I sent it tomorrow morning. Nora put me on a pedestal for sharing my truth and for my ability to cut through bullshit. It felt good to spend time with her because in her eyes, I wasn't the insecure little boy that was doing everything he could to heal. I was the expert that could dissect every one of her problems and help her see them as they really were. I was everything I wanted to be. Yet the undeniable truth was that I was lying to her out of fear of losing her and having to face myself again. She was upset when I finally told her the truth, but more than anything, she was confused. We exchanged a few texts about what happened and why the sudden change of heart. I immediately felt relief, the same way I had after Shannon and I ended things. It didn't matter that I wouldn't have company or sex for a while. I had regained my peace of mind. I thought being honest with her was the worst, most evil thing I could do. It would shatter the illusion that this was going somewhere and force her to feel sad, even if only momentarily. The truth turned out to be the opposite. Being honest with Nora meant she could begin to move on. 2 months later, she texted me this. In case you didn't realize, you've inspired me in a really big way. Just wanted to say I'm incredibly grateful for you and have a lot of respect for what you're doing in your life. I feel like my whole life I've been planning the someday where I'd be myself. Then I saw you doing that and realized I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Chapter 33. Therapy. In this chapter, I will detail my experiences with 2 different forms of therapy, talk therapy and psychedelic therapy. The stigma around therapy is most prevalent for men, though with psychedelics, the stigma doesn't discriminate. Deciding to see a therapist for the first time is hard. It was for me. It forced me to accept that I needed help. For a lot of us, men especially, Mexican men even more especially, needing help is considered a weakness. Seeing therapy as a weakness is a contradiction, because it takes courage to do something that isn't widely accepted and to subject oneself to the grueling process it can be. It's actually really fucking hard to go to therapy, but nothing is harder than healing alone. Talk therapy. The first therapist I ever saw was a woman. I was 17 and recommended to her by Valentina, my high school girlfriend. She was Valentina's therapist too. When I asked my dad if I could see her, he told me I didn't need a therapist. He said, "You're not a crazy person. You're just a teenager." I insisted, and the deal my dad eventually agreed to was that he would pay for 3 sessions and reassess after that. His exact words were, "If you still feel like you need a therapist after that, we'll talk. I can't spend all my money on something you don't need." Each session cost $20. Money was not the issue. After 3 sessions, my dad agreed to pay for only 2 more. I told my therapist about this. She didn't seem surprised. "Let's make the most of the time we do have," she said. Seeing her was one of the first times that I ever felt validated in my feelings about my parents, specifically my dad. I talked about our relationship, and she explained to me what dynamics were at play. She wasn't a friend of the family, or a teacher, or a colleague of my dad's. Her only interest was to help me. Your dad may not ever tell you he loves you, she said, but have you ever thought about telling him you love him? I fought back against the idea. Let me reframe it, she continued. Think of your dad as a clock. Do you know how clocks work? I nodded my head no. A clock has gears that turn to make the dials on the head spin around the numbers. One gear moves another that moves another, and what do you think happens if you remove one gear? The clock stops working? Exactly, she said. Think of your relationship with your dad that way. Neither of you tells the other you love him. That's how the clock currently works. If you change your behavior, the current dynamic stops working and you have to adjust. If you tell your dad you love him, you're automatically changing the status quo and forcing your dad to respond to a new situation. That day, I wrote my dad a letter because I was afraid to tell him in person how I was feeling. This is an English translation of that letter. Dad, I wanted to tell you some things I've never been able to talk with you about. First of all, I wanted you to know that things are getting better with my girlfriend, and we are going to San Francisco after all. Even though the situation with her has improved, that doesn't mean I'm not still considering moving to San Francisco with Mom. Also, well, know that I love you and that I feel I never say it to you and you never say it to me, and I just wasn't sure that you knew that. Thank you for everything you've done for me and our family all these years. You really are the best dad I could have asked for. About my dive master certification, it's not that I don't like to scuba. It's that I like it more as a recreational activity and when I do it with you. I'm not saying I won't want to get certified in the future, I just don't feel like I have time with school and everything else I'm doing to add that on top. But I didn't know how to tell you that because I don't want to hurt you, and I felt like that's what I would be doing. Finally, I would like you to take my dream of being a poker player more seriously. It's not just a pipe dream. Poker is for me what photography was and still is for you. I love you. Nick. I left the letter in the kitchen before I went to school. That night, Dad came into my room and sat down with me to talk about it. He told me he loved me for the first time in years. In our last session, my therapist and I made a list of everything we had learned together. It shocked me how relevant to my life the list was when I found it years later. Number 1. I must see the child inside of others if I really want to understand them. Number 2. Stop trying to control everything. I can't. Number 3. Boiling pot metaphor. Don't let anger build up. Feel it little by little. Number 4. Don't try to help or rescue everyone. That's too much responsibility and not mine to carry. Number 5. Think of how things will affect you too, not just how they will affect others. Number 6. Distance yourself when losing self-control. Come back when you've regained it. At 17, living in Cancun, Mexico, no matter how true this list was to me, no matter how impactful my letter to Dad, the external pressure was too much for me to handle on my own. I was led to water, but no one could have forced me to drink it. Finding the right therapist is hard, and it takes time, especially if I don't know what I'm looking for. It's also a process of trial and error. In total, I've seen 5 different therapists, and though each one has helped me learn important lessons, directly or indirectly, I still don't feel like I've found the right one. It took years for me to go back to therapy. This time I was in a relationship with Nat, my girlfriend before Kiki. and things had started to fall apart. When I picked Alex, I picked her because I was attracted to her. No joke. This is what I mean when I say it's especially hard if I don't know what I'm looking for. I can end up choosing someone because of the way they look. I saw Alex for 6 months, and then I ghosted her. She was a white woman who had finished college. I didn't feel like she understood me. I felt judged and unsafe with Alex. I only kept seeing her so I could feel like I was doing the work. Meanwhile, I was cheating on Nat, masturbating on camera for $250 an hour, and meeting up with strange men who paid me to give them blowjobs. Soon after I stopped going to therapy, my relationship with Nat ended. I didn't go back to therapy until my next relationship started to fall apart, the one you read about in this book. That's where Javier came in. Hispanic, older male who immigrated to the US. As I write this, my time with Javier is coming to an end. We have 3 weeks left, and by the end of our time together, I will have seen him for just over 2 years. Our work started with Kiki and my memoir. Since I've been single, our work shifted toward my relationship with my parents and my inner child. This time, I've talked at length about my sexual fluidity, as he likes to call it, my distorted relationship to sex and men, as I prefer to call it. Unlike with Alex, with Javier, I feel safe enough to bring up anything. Emotions are still hard for me to feel with him, but I've managed to do it on several occasions. The most important was when he told me he was leaving the counseling center and that because of a rule, we wouldn't be able to see each other anymore. The news brought up a lot of my feelings of abandonment. I thought, I'm so unlovable that even my therapist is leaving me. When Javier broke the news, my gut was to save my tears for after therapy. I didn't want to put how I was feeling on him. Mind you, I was paying him to do exactly that. Somehow I was able to cry anyway. We both expressed how we felt, and then had time to give the relationship closure, something that's escaped me for most of my life. We rewrote an ending. My relationships don't all have to end abruptly and with intense pain. From our last few months together, 2 things stand out. I relapsed with sex addiction, and I actively started the process of healing what many refer to as the mother wound. When I relapsed, Javier didn't see it as the catastrophic event that I did. He was compassionate and understanding. You're doing work that brings up a lot of difficult emotions, and your default for avoiding those emotions is to have sex with men. Recognize that. This is actually a sign of progress, he said. The mother wound basically means unresolved trauma that was passed down to me from my mother. Manifestations of the mother wound can look like comparison, fear of judgment, weak boundaries, sacrificing wants for another, difficulty expressing emotions, codependency, seeking approval, low self-worth, self-sabotage, discomfort in social situations, and more. Actively healing this wound means trying to better understand my mother's relationship to herself, her parents, and me. It means going back and feeling all of the emotions that I suppressed because I felt like it was my job to protect her from them. Here, healing means rewriting another ending, one in which I don't end up reliving my childhood. It started with Javier's idea that I write my mom a letter. You don't have to send it to her, he said. Just write it. The letter is not for my mother. It's for me. I wrote the letter because I wasn't sure I needed her to hear any of this, but I was sure that I needed to say it. I didn't set an expectation of sending it because I wanted to be as raw as I could and write it without wanting to protect her. It's important to note that before I could do any of this work, I had to create distance between my mom and me. For some, it may be possible to start healing their mother wound while still holding a relationship with her. For me, it was not. It took me years to be able to separate. It took trial and error, trying to separate and failing to, coming back for validation when things got hard. I heard from many that what I was doing was selfish. If I want to heal, I will need some degree of selfish. Ketamine. Ketamine infusions are not for everyone. Psychedelic therapy in general is not for everyone. It should also be noted that doing psychedelics in a therapeutic environment is an entirely different experience than doing them for fun. I have done both. Once you go therapy, it's hard to go back. The basic thing to understand about psychedelics and why they're so transformative is this. Your ego is afraid of change and wants to protect you from it. It knows very well how to hide your traumas from you because it wants to keep you from reliving them. What it doesn't know is that you need to do exactly that in order to let go of them. Only this time with an empathic witness present. When psychedelics enter your system, they make your ego feel safe, or completely annihilate it, so that you can access these traumas and finally heal from them. My experience with ketamine infusions is singular to my traumas and the result of those traumas. Everyone's experience is different. I decided to try it because I have deep trauma from childhood that I needed to release, and everything I had tried up to that point hadn't done that. Therapy and meditation helped a lot, but my experience with those remained very intellectual. I wasn't feeling or releasing trauma. I was hiding behind the comfort of understanding it. The difference between feeling and understanding is enormous. It's the difference between spending an entire day planning on doing things and actually doing them. Thinking about my trauma is not going to heal me. Only feeling it will. Ketamine infusions started that process for me. I'm only going to share the lessons I learned during it. If you want to read in depth about my experience, I wrote an essay on Medium called What Ketamine Infusions Did for Me. My first infusion highlighted how much of my trauma revolves around trust, or a lack thereof. Trust is my biggest roadblock to meaningful relationships. My second infusion showed me memories. The first was from childhood and represented missed opportunities in my life, and how often I deprive myself of positive experiences out of fear of how others will react. The second was of Kiki and every relationship I lost when we broke up. I felt how everyone in my life is connected to at least one other person. Therefore, I cannot end one relationship without ending another, or at least fracturing it. The infusion ended with a sexual urge directed at a close friend of mine. When I sobered up, the urge went away. On the way home, I reframed the urge from the lens of trauma. I don't just sexualize some women, I sexualize all women. I do this because I never learned of any other way to relate to women. On a deep subconscious level, doing this allows me to protect myself from intimacy and rejection. For my next infusion, I felt the love that exists when I forgive myself for being human. Without my ego in the way, I allowed realities I would otherwise consider mutually exclusive to coexist. Yes, I need to enforce boundaries with my mom. And yes, we also love each other deeply. Yes, Kiki and I are no longer together, and we hurt each other when we were. And yes, underneath it all, we forgive and we love. Yes, there is a lot of work I still need to do to heal. And yes, I can also be happy right now. From another infusion. At my core, I feel that I was a mistake, that I was a burden to my parents. The two people in my life I was supposed to feel most loved by were the least excited to see me because I was a reminder to them of a period in their life it hurt them to think about. Writing used to be the center of my universe because it helped me feel less like a burden. I used to see everything that I wrote as proof that I was worthy of this world. Through ketamine infusions, I learned that I am worthy for no other reason than because I exist. I don't need to earn my own love. Psilocybin. I ate 6 grams of golden teacher mushrooms. That's 1 gram above the average hero's dose. A hero's dose is basically a dose big enough to knock down all of our defenses. I did 6 instead of 5 because I know my defenses are higher than most, and because my past experiences have helped me develop a tolerance to psychedelics. I was in my bedroom, which has 2 big windows. When I open them both, so much natural light and sound comes in that it can feel like I'm outdoors. I invited my friend Reagan over to act as my guide. She arrived around noon, and though she was in my space, she very quickly made it her own. She burned incense, charcoal, made tea, and set a mat down on the floor next to my bed, where she sat cross-legged during the first hour of my session. Unlike all the other times I had done psychedelic mushrooms, this time I was ready to heal. I was rested, at peace with where my life was, and at ease with my fears. A couple hours in, the medicine started to do its work. I started to think about my relationship with Dad and how I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years. Emotions came up around the distance that existed between us when I was younger. I felt sadness and a longing for us to be closer. On my bed, in the fetal position, holding a rag against my face, I wept as I went into a state of split consciousness. One was me, then, at 24. The other one, the one that was bringing it all up, was me when I was a kid. The latter was centered on the years that I lived in my childhood home. It was a beautiful home, a big home, but my experience didn't match its appearance. My family was separated, everyone in their own room, the dogs outside, neglected. It hit me hard. The awareness of younger me was afraid. He was sad, he was alone, he wanted to be told that everything was going to be okay. Me, at 24, was very aware that that was what was happening, that I wasn't reliving trauma. I was bringing it back up with the awareness that it's in the past and that I can handle it now. That everything is, indeed, going to be okay. Those 2 hours of weeping were a release of suppressed emotions from my past. The way I like to think about it is that I have this little tank inside of me that holds all of my suppressed emotions. I think of it as a scuba tank. A scuba tank has a valve, and when I turn it, it makes a hissing noise that means I'm releasing pressurized air from inside. My inner tank does the same thing, only it doesn't release air when I turn its valve. It releases emotions. When I turn the valve and release emotions, it can feel like I'm a disturbance to others, so my instinct is to close it and stop the hissing or crying. Done right, if I feed the tank mushrooms, it releases as many suppressed emotions as it can. I still have to allow the release to happen. It won't happen on its own, but it's a hell of a lot easier to do that with psychedelics. However long I've been holding on to these past emotions for, once I become aware of my tank and aware of another way to engage with those emotions, I have 2 choices. I can ignore it and go about my life the way I was before, or I can integrate my experience. When I choose to ignore it, I begin to hate aspects of my reality, like my job, but never do anything about it. That's because I'm afraid to feel the rejection and abandonment that comes with not living up to other people's expectations. If I do what I really want to do, then people might reject me. And because that was my experience as a kid, and when I was a kid that felt like the end of the world, I do everything I can to avoid reliving the same trauma. All that's really happening is that my tank is letting me know I have unreleased emotions. I'm not going to relive the same trauma I experienced back then, but it's going to feel that way until I let what happened to me resurface and then release it. When the experience was over, I felt that everything was going to be okay. I figured out a way to feel my pain, and that's the only thing getting in the way of me and my future. MDMA. MDMA wasn't entirely what I expected it would be. but it still changed my life. I learned about it 3 years before I actually experienced it for myself. As I entered into a new romantic relationship after Kiki, I felt a ton of my wounds resurface. I reached a new depth of rock bottom and felt that everything I had been doing to heal had helped, but only so much. I felt that MDMA was the only hope I had left. During my first session, I experienced a resistance that is common in first-timers. After 2 hours of deep, peaceful meditation, I began to feel skeptical. I had spent $1,500 for this experience, and all I was getting out of it was peace? Couldn't I have done this at home, for free? Toward the end, after I had resisted most of the medicine, my guide introduced me to the concept of a gatekeeper, that voice in my head that judges all of my life experiences to protect me from pain. I learned that my gatekeeper tends to want to be right, often to protect me from feeling hopeless, and instead keep me feeling in control. The first session helped me understand how deeply embedded in me this gatekeeper is, and how much he affects my ability to experience people, places, and things for what they are, and not for what they have been in my past. Before MDMA, I mostly listened to the voice in my head that wanted to resist, the gatekeeper. Post-MDMA, my integration work was to recognize when my gatekeeper started to take over and to learn to listen to what feels right in my gut, not in my mind. One way my guide suggested that I do this was by speaking to my gatekeeper. Yes, out loud. He suggested that when I notice him come in, I say, "Thanks for your input, but if you want me to listen to you, I need you to say that in a nicer way." After the first session, I was flooded with moments like these. They weren't new, and there weren't more than usual. It was just that my perspective of them had shifted. For example, one day I was at work, and a song I'd listened to hundreds of times already came on. Only this time, I felt a strong emotion tied to it that I hadn't felt before. And whereas before, I would have unconsciously rejected the emotion out of fear, now, I chose to step away for a couple of minutes to feel the emotion and then let it go. Another example was when my ex and I had a conversation that triggered my fear of abandonment. When it ended, she asked if there was anything she could do to help, if there was anything I needed. I heard one voice say, "Don't burden her with your needs. They're not that important." And another voice said, "Is there something you need? And can you express that to her?" I realized I did have a need. I expressed it to her, and she met it instantly. My whole body relaxed, like it was thanking me for not neglecting it. I felt more connected to my girlfriend and more capable of showing up for her and for myself moving forward. It was incredible to watch how different my life could be if only I made different choices. If only I had that 5-second pause before reacting to respond instead. In a way, MDMA gave me a window of time to notice how much of life I was missing out on. I did my second session 3 months after my first. My life looked very different. My relationship had ended, my best friend had moved away, and doctors had found a tumor in my dad's brain. In the month leading up, I felt a ton of grief. Because I no longer had a girlfriend to distract myself with, I also reconnected with my support network and with myself. I reacquainted myself with my core values and deepest wounds, which allowed me to better prepare for the session. I read a lot of books about trauma, journaled every day, went on at least 4 nature walks per week, cried almost daily, and rediscovered the art of being creative for the sake of being creative, without any agenda in mind. I avoided consuming too much media and tried to create as much empty space in my days to sit with myself. The goal of preparation, I learned this time, is to make room for myself to just be, because being allows me to go deep into myself rather than continue to get distracted by the external world. In order for my psyche to bring up what it needs to during an MDMA session, it can't be clogged up with everyone else's day-to-day problems, including my own. The main difference for my second session was that I combined MDMA and psilocybin mushrooms. I started with the first dose of MDMA and sat with it for 30 minutes. Then I took the second dose and sat with that for over an hour. This time I felt it. Everything I expected to feel the first time around. Joy, love, warm vibrations in my body, connection to myself, connection to the world. Then I took 5 grams of psilocybin and continued to ride the positive energy wave. It was like all of the fodder I create to sever my connections to people went away. I connected to the purest form of love that I believe exists, the highest resonance of it, the kind of love that we don't decide to give or take, but rather just are. I sorted through different people and different memories with a new perspective, gratitude. From there, trauma started to surface. My body braced itself for something it didn't want to feel. I saw my parents and my childhood home and felt an undertone of darkness emanating from them. I stayed with the feeling and didn't resist it. I surrendered to the medicine and trusted that it was trying to show me something important. It took a while for that to happen, but eventually it did. My legs shook and my body clammed up. My arms tensed and my hands contracted. On its own, my body tightened. My guide noticed my energy shift and approached me to ask if I was okay. "Yeah," I said. "I'm seeing some images of sexual trauma come up, but I'm okay. There's a layer of separation between me and what I'm seeing." "Can I hold your hand?" he asked. I nodded and held his hand as best I could with how tight my fingers were. Then he put one hand on my chest and one hand on my belly. When he did this, I felt a surge of energy coursing through me, like a current of electricity. It bounced back and forth between neck, shoulders, chest, belly, and groin. Each time the energy stopped at one of those points, I felt physical pain in that area. I know how crazy that sounds. It still feels that way to me as I write it. I've never felt anything like it in my life. As he was doing this, he said, "There's a lot of blocked energy that's trying to get out. Let's give it a place to go. Take some deep breaths. You're okay now. You're safe." I breathed into the pain, and the images I was being shown started to crystallize. It wasn't one specific memory, but more an aggregate of all the different times I experienced the same event. I was 13 again, lying sideways on my couch, naked. It was late at night. My dad and older brother were asleep in their bedrooms, and I was in the open living room area. In front of me was my laptop and webcam. I could hear an older man's voice through my headphones, commanding me to follow his instructions, which varied from hurting to pleasuring myself. I remembered how stressed I felt, worried about when the next time would be that one of the men I spoke to would get upset at me for not being available all of the time. I worried that their threats might not be empty, and that one day a video of me doing these sexual acts would appear on the internet for all of my friends to see. These memories weren't new to me. I wrote a whole book where I talk about a bunch of them, but I'd never experienced them like this, full of emotion and pain. Intellectually, I knew these events had happened. I just hadn't caught up emotionally. After a couple more hours of this, my body gave out. I felt drained and shook up. My brain was running full speed ahead with its desire to process and understand what had just happened and what it all meant. But it was failing to make any of its theories stick. I talked to my guide about it and found some comfort there. He hugged me and explained what might be going on for me as best he could. When I got home, I had another strong emotional release. I couldn't run away from the events of my past anymore, and I sure as hell couldn't run away from the emotions either. I felt sad and alienated, and I cried as a thought repeated itself in my head. I was sexually abused as a child. It took 2 days for my body to feel normal again. That is, to stop vomiting and getting headaches. My muscles remained sore for over a week, especially the ones in my forearm. Not only was I out of sync physically, my mental and emotional states were off too. I experienced a reckoning with myself, bringing to awareness a part of me that I had buried. I didn't do much the first 2 days. My stomach was still upset, so I ate very little and drank lots of green juice. Thinking of my session made me nauseous, so I could only journal for short amounts of time. I sat in silence for extended periods. I listened to music and cried a lot. I tried not to talk about my experience. It was recommended that I don't talk about it for at least a week after the fact, and that as best I can, I try to avoid assigning meaning to it for the same duration. On day 6, I had my integration session with my guide. It was 90 minutes over Zoom. We talked about the concept of a shadow, the parts of me that I keep hidden from myself and instead project outward onto those around me. When I was a teenager, I made the decision to seek out connection with older men. I allowed them to do the things they did to me. I did know how I felt about it, and I was the one who rejected my voice of reason. That voice of reason never got to see the light of day. It became a part of my shadow. And how did it manifest? In anyone who rejected my story. When I rejected the idea that I didn't respect myself when I engaged in these behaviors, I got angry at people who implied that that was what I did. Their questions triggered me. Eventually, my guide said, if you get to a place of acceptance around this, your psyche will no longer need to project it. It projects because it wants to be seen. When you bring this into awareness and recognize it in yourself, you give it the space it needs. It's important to note that taking responsibility here did not mean blaming myself. Blame is a very different thing, and frankly, it's not very useful. Blame implies that it's my fault. Taking responsibility means I understand why I did the things I did. I forgive myself for doing them, and I move forward with this awareness in mind. When I take responsibility for the role I played in my abuse, I gain agency over the role it will play in my present. There were healthier choices available to me at that time. Recognizing that allows me to choose them now. But first, I had to go back to that moment and feel all of the emotions I thought I could bypass. Otherwise, I wouldn't have felt the impact of my decisions and, therefore, wouldn't have had the desire to do anything about it. Here are some more unedited notes from my integration session. When I suppress emotions, they manifest in others around me as triggers. There was a part of me that knew what I was doing, but I compartmentalized it back then so that I could feel the love and connection from older men. Feel the sadness from wounds of abandonment, but don't get stuck there. That's victim mindset. Don't create a set of rules, good, bad, do, don't. Instead, develop an awareness and you'll make new decisions that way. Shame comes from 2 places, perpetrators and from knowing I didn't respect myself back then. Reparenting can look like giving myself the things I feel I was lacking as a child. Chapter 34. Habits and Tools. Healing used to feel abstract. I asked myself the typical questions. How do I feel my emotions? What will that even do for me? How does linking a behavior back to childhood help me? I wanted solutions and I wanted them fast because I wanted to feel in control. But a big part of healing means letting go of my need for control. So how do I reconcile the two? In this chapter, I'm going to share with you unhealthy habits I replaced with healthier ones, and tools I use on a regular basis to uphold my commitment to healing. It's important to understand that in order for these to work, I had to commit, which means holding myself accountable. Being with Kiki, it was hard for me to commit to healing. It felt like it went in direct opposition to the well-being of our relationship, mostly because of my attachment issues. I viewed us changing as a threat to our relationship, so I did everything I could to make sure we didn't. The following habit changes and tools are all actionable and created a positive change in my life. I practice these with grace and compassion. They are meant to help me heal, not torture myself. Mind-altering substances. I don't believe mind-altering substances are inherently bad for me. Whether it's coffee, booze, weed, or pills, what matters is how I relate to each substance. Do I drink coffee first thing in the morning, 7 days a week? Do I drink at least one beer every day? Do I smoke weed every night just so I can fall asleep? Do I take Adderall to finish work that I've procrastinated? With each of these behaviors, the question I want to answer is, why? Not the why that helps me feel better about myself, the why that is at the core of my behavior. Why coffee? Maybe anxiety keeps me up at night, and drinking coffee in the morning is easier than feeling said anxiety and improving the quality of my sleep. Why booze? Maybe I need a better reward system that doesn't negatively affect my health. For me, the answer is always a fear of feeling my emotions. That's why my relationship to mind-altering substances is first on the list. I believe it's the most important habit to look at, and generally, the one that most negatively affects my health and commitment to the work. My drug of choice was marijuana. I started with friends and occasionally bought some for myself. Then I realized every time I smoked with friends, all I wanted was to be alone. So I started buying more regularly. Once I did that, I smoked every single day. I could never set boundaries, ever. When I did, I still took tiny hits and told myself it didn't count. I got high every chance I got. If I went to concerts, I sneaked in joints. If I went to the movie theater, I smoked them beforehand. If I spent time with friends, I always brought weed with me just in case they didn't have any. Why marijuana? It helped me escape my reality. Sometimes it heightened it and made it worse, but even then, feeling weed paranoia was easier and more exciting than feeling anxiety, because at least then I knew it was the weed that caused it, not all of the problems I was choosing to ignore. Smoking weed made it easier to move through the day because no matter if it went good or bad, I knew as soon as I came home that I could get high. If I feel anxious and lose my appetite, weed will fix that. If I'm bored, weed will fix that. If I can't sleep, weed will fix that. My core why, however, is that it's hard for me to turn down opportunities that are detrimental to my well-being when the narrative my whole life has been that I'm not good enough as I am. I believed I deserved misery, so I found a way to make her part of my daily existence. On December 2nd, 2019, I stopped cold turkey. I didn't experience withdrawals or cravings. It wasn't that kind of dependency. Instead, I stopped spending time with the friends I used to get high with. The quality of my sleep improved and my dreams returned in vivid fashion. I stopped looking for excuses to get high and started facing those difficult moments. Harder than quitting the drug was quitting the friendships. I met one of my best friends in Austin. We grew very close over the course of 3 years. Whenever one of us felt down, we smoked blunts and watched movies, played video games, or got deep in conversation. He was always there for me. He never judged me. He just passed me the blunt and helped me distract myself. He tried to help me the best way he knew how to. It's not easy moving on from that kind of friendship. It provided me with adventure. It was fun and it felt unpredictable. But it wasn't reality. At least not the reality that I want for my future. I'll end this with a short conversation a loved one and I had in 2018, a little over a year before I quit. This person had been sober for 2 months when I called them. "So how's life going now that you're not smoking?" I said. "Actually, I started smoking again," they said. "Really? What changed?" "I missed it. I think I'm a much better person when I'm high." "Are you glad you're smoking again?" I asked. "It's the best decision I've ever made." "Tell me more." "It just got too hard moving through life without it. Whenever I woke up, all I wanted was to go back to sleep. Throughout the day, I waited in anticipation of bedtime when it would all go away again. But now that I'm smoking again, I don't feel that." Exercise. Exercise is one of the most important forms of integration for any kind of healing. Few things can help me reconnect to my body the way that exercise does. A big component to healing is reconnecting to what I learned to disconnect from when I was in pain, which was my body. When I look around, I notice that exercise is often sold as one of these two things: a way to look good and gain the approval of others, or a war we can wage on our mind and body as a means of avoiding our emotions. The latter is why so many people are drawn to running. It's one of the forms of exercise that is hardest on the body long term, but it helps to quiet the mind, even if only temporarily, so people flock to it. Rather than something I can beat myself up over, I prefer to look at exercise as a way of developing self-compassion. If I begin to feel physical pain, I listen to my body. If I get too in my head as a way of avoiding exercise, I try to understand where those thoughts are coming from and if, perhaps, I can afford myself rest that day. The reason I wholeheartedly disagree with the no pain, no gain mentality is because it teaches me to be in opposition to myself. I hear huge names say it all the time. Your mind is a bitch. You have to learn to conquer it. I've tried that before. It works if I want to become a slave to the habit. It doesn't work if I want to develop and maintain habits that will serve me. Approaching exercise this way only taught me not to trust myself. If I missed a day, the narrative in my head was that I would be more likely to miss the next. And if I missed enough days, I would destroy the habit. For over 3 years now, I've taken a different approach, one that encourages me to trust myself. I don't miss days. I choose to rest. If I rest for 2 or more consecutive days, I explore why. Maybe I started a new job or relationship that added stress to my life. Maybe I'm digging up old wounds that activate my fight or flight or freeze response. Whatever the reason for missed days, I don't then go and feel guilty about them. Exercise is a tool to help me reconnect with my body and mind. Missed days are just another piece of the puzzle. They are not indicators that I'm doing it wrong. The only wrong way to exercise is to make it another problem in my life. Fearing the missed days is the best way to do that. Single tasking. Doing one thing at a time may sound scary. With the amount of opportunity and content that exists in the world today, multitasking can seem like the only way to take advantage of it all. It has become so commonplace that half the time I don't even realize I'm doing it. When I go to the movie theater, I buy food that I eat while I watch the movie. Fitness instructors play loud, energizing music during classes to get everyone pumped up. Runners listen to podcasts or that same energizing music when they run. People who work on their computer 8 hours a day spend a chunk of that time texting friends or perusing the internet. Hell, how many car accidents are caused daily because we text and drive? It's almost weird not to multitask. How often do you see runners without headphones? How many of your friends can't get from point A to point B without using the Maps feature on their phone? When was the last time you ate a meal without doing something else at the same time? It doesn't matter what two things I'm doing. Multitasking is a great indicator that one of those is not worth my time. I'm doing it to fill time or space in my life. By focusing on one task at a time, I engage in the present and reconnect with my body and mind. For example, if I paid attention to how I felt during a movie, I might realize that I want to stop watching it and do something else, instead of picking up my phone and doing both on autopilot. I used to always watch videos when I ate meals. It was something I did unconsciously because I was afraid of the pain that would come up for me if I ate in silence, like the realization that I eat most of my meals alone these days. In fact, now that I mostly eat without distractions, I have found myself on the verge of tears at times. I used to multitask during almost every activity I engaged in. Every single time it was because I wanted to disconnect from my body or mind. Exercising in silence helps me focus deeper on my physical sensations. Driving without distractions makes me a safer driver. Meditating without a guided meditation or music allows me to sit with my own thoughts more. The more I focus on one task at a time, the more space I can give my mind to think about things it may otherwise be too busy for. This single realization has changed the way that I approach problem solving. Now, if I have a problem, my first move is to sit and do nothing. 9 times out of 10, the solution to that problem comes to me in the silence. Meditation. To sit and do nothing seems counterintuitive if we're looking for answers. How will we find what we need if we don't do anything? When I first suggested to my brother that he try meditation, he didn't see the point. His ego was so in control that he didn't realize it was making the decision for him. His ego was afraid of the change this activity could bring to his life. And the best way for his ego to convince him of this was by diminishing the value of meditation. When it was me telling him to try it, he didn't take action. Then, one day, he heard someone he admired talking about it on a podcast. The man's name was Naval Ravikant. What Naval suggested was that meditation is largely misunderstood. People make a practice of avoiding by using a practice that's designed to do the exact opposite. We listen to a guided meditation, we focus on our breath, or we sit and actively try to clear our minds. We use these different points of focus as a way to avoid our thoughts. But what if instead of avoiding them, we learn to give them space? What if some of those thoughts are actually solutions to our problems? What if we have busied ourselves so much in our day-to-day that to stop and allow ourselves to think would bring up new thoughts, or thoughts we believe are new because of how far we have pushed them down? Naval frames it like this: for 60 days, spend 1 hour every day sitting with your eyes closed and do nothing else in that time. Watch it radically alter the way you live your life, or, if it doesn't serve you, drop it and move on from the experiment. He goes on to explain that he chose 60 days because it takes at least that long for us to clear the junk we've accumulated throughout our lives. All the random song lyrics, movie quotes, internet images, YouTube comments, and so on. He chose 60 minutes because it takes about 30 minutes to get over the initial discomfort of sitting and doing nothing. The itching, the desire to readjust our position, and only then do we start to go deep. His email inbox analogy is great for understanding how this works. He says, when you grow up, there's all this stuff happening to you in your life. And some of it you're processing, some of it you're absorbing, and some of it you should probably think a little bit more about and work through, but you don't. You don't have time. So it gets buried. And it's all these preferences and judgments and unresolved situations and issues. It's like your email inbox. It's just piling up. Email after email after email that's not answered, going back 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And then when you sit down to meditate, those emails start coming back at you. Hey, what about this issue? What about that issue? Have you solved this? Did you think about that? You have regrets here, you have issues there, and that gets scary. People don't want to do that. It's not working. I can't clear my mind. I better get up and not do this. But really what's happening is that it's self-therapy. Instead of paying a therapist to sit there and listen to you, you're listening to yourself. And you just have to sit there as those emails go through one by one and work through each of them until you get to the magical inbox 0. 2 examples from my real life of how these hourly, daily meditations have impacted me. In the simple one, it was mid-December and my brother invited me to spend Christmas with him and his girlfriend, Evelyn. Evelyn's mom would be there too. I wanted to buy all 3 of them gifts, but I knew very little about Evelyn and her mom. Day after day, I stressed over not having good ideas. I played out Christmas morning in my head. They would hand me amazing gifts, and I would shrug my shoulders and apologize for theirs. A full week went by before an idea came to me. I'm going to sit and close my eyes and see if any gift ideas come to me. Naturally, I thought of at least 3 different gifts for each of them. Problem solved. The layered example has to do with my relationship to writing and just doing in general. When I started doing these 60-minute meditations, I quickly realized that this new, unaccounted for hour was going to disrupt my daily routine. Before long, I found that the disruption actually took place in my mind, not in the external concept of a routine. I had stopped writing an hour a day. I still wrote, just not every day, and not an hour every time. But unlike before, this time I didn't beat myself up or feel inferior because of it. Instead, I trusted myself more and stopped being a slave to the act of writing. The world doesn't end if I don't write 1 day, or 2, or 3, or even a full week. I'm not going to lose my ability to write. I used to fully believe that if I stopped, I would fall behind and be forgotten about. By prioritizing an hour of doing nothing over an hour of writing, I shifted my mindset from doing and creating to being and existing. I no longer live my life in anticipation of the next story-worthy event. I live my life for the sake of living it and witnessing what's right in front of me every day. 60 minutes for 60 days. Watch what happens. Music. When I was younger, I used music to help me emote. I listened to happy music when I was happy, sad music when I was sad, and angry music when I was angry. When Dad, Todd, and I lived in Dad's apartment, I liked to wait for them to go to bed so I could go up to the rooftop and cry with sad music playing in my ears. When I drove home from seeing my high school girlfriend, often after a fight, I wept as I listened to Mumford & Sons. I've always felt safest crying alone, even to this day. I live with my brother, but it's hard for me to cry when I know he can hear me from his bedroom. But after Kiki broke up with me, this mental block seemed to go away for a while. I'd come home from work, curl up in the fetal position, listen to the playlist she and I made together on Spotify, and wail for hours. No matter what stage of grieving I'm in, music always forms a part of the experience. Since the breakup with Kiki, I've moved this habit into my conscious mind and made it another tool to help me emote. When I sit down to feel my emotions, music works magic on me. I tailored together a playlist that I titled Emotions. You can search for my name on Spotify and find the playlist there. It's public. But I don't know that my specific playlist will work for you the way it does for me. So here's how I decided what songs to include in it. Look back at your life. Go as far back as you want. Think of all the different stages of your life. Maybe, like me, your parents separated or divorced when you were young. You probably felt very sad then. Maybe you experienced heartbreak all throughout high school. Maybe you felt extremely vulnerable when you lost your virginity. Or maybe you lost a loved one too soon. What music did you listen to when you experienced that? What music did your parents listen to that they passed down to you that now also holds a special place in your heart? What music did your ex-partners show you that will forever remind you of them? The key here is to try to reconnect to your younger self. It doesn't have to be sad music. Most of mine is because sadness is the emotion that I most need help with. Consider the emotion you struggle to feel the most. Then search for a time in your life when you felt that emotion very intensely. Create the playlist based on music that reminds you of that time. If you're struggling, TV shows were a great place to start for me. What TV shows did you watch when you were younger? Find the soundtrack to those shows. Whether or not the show made you sad is irrelevant. Remember, the point is to go back to that time and place. Once you have your playlist made, or at least part of it, you can use it in different ways depending on what emotion the playlist captures. For example, with my emotions playlist, because it's my sadness I'm reconnecting with, I like to turn the lights off in my bedroom and let only natural light in through my window. I do this around sunset so that my room goes from light to dark and I feel hidden. Sometimes I look at pictures that remind me of that time, but other than that, I do nothing else while I listen to it. I use this time to create space for all the times I was sad and didn't have time or didn't feel safe enough to emote. Build your environment around the emotion you're trying to capture and create time in your schedule to focus all of your energy on it. Walking. It wasn't until the lockdowns that I started to go on walks again. I don't do it as exercise, though that's a nice bonus. My walks are a way to get centered. I go on them shirtless to increase exposure to the sun. I immediately feel more grounded as soon as I step foot outside of my apartment. I never bring time with me, only my apartment key. My goal is to force a disconnect from technology and to-dos. In a sense, I want to forget about my life for a moment and reconnect to the outside world. Seeing other humans go about their life gives me perspective on whatever troubles I face. No matter the hardship, the world keeps moving. I never force myself to do it if I don't feel up for it. I try to make it spontaneous, a way to rediscover my natural curiosity and sense of adventure. I never set a time limit. I just walk until I want to go back. Few things ground me as much as walking. It is its own form of meditation. I enjoy sweating, my skin changing color from the sun's rays, my feet getting dirty, having to be mindful of staying hydrated, and maybe even bringing a dog along from time to time. I've often been told by professionals to ground myself by observing my immediate surroundings. Notice the ceiling fan. Notice the wrinkles on your bed. Notice the shadows on the wall. This has never worked for me. As long as I'm trapped in my little cage I call a room, grounding is a hard thing to do. However, when I change my environment, I pay more attention to it. Grounding becomes second nature instead of a grueling exercise in willpower. I never underestimate the simple things. Healing and reconnecting don't require that much effort or money. They can be as simple as walking around my neighborhood the way I did when I was a small child. Chapter 35. The Books That Made Me. Without books, I wouldn't be where I am today. I never would have learned about Charles Bukowski and thought to myself, I could one day have my own apartment in LA and a job at the post office. I could one day be a writer. I never would have learned about meditation through the skepticism of Dan Harris, which I very much needed in order to buy into such a concept at 19. Without books, the word vulnerability would still strike me as a synonym for weakness rather than courage, as Brené Brown taught me. Books were nearly ruined for me in school. Teachers always asked us to find symbolism and metaphors and themes. We read all the same books that no high school boy is interested in. The Scarlet Letter, anything by Shakespeare, The Great Gatsby. I hated reading, and I hated the assignments that went with it. None of the questions ever spoke to me. Why did insert name emphasize the color green in this chapter? There was only ever one answer. You probably remember the moment. The teacher asks the question out loud. Everyone starts raising their hand and shouting out what they think is the answer. The teacher says, yeah, getting close. Anyone else? And finally gives the answer from her reading companion. I wasn't taught how to think for myself. I was taught to look for the same thing as everyone else, the right answer. My individual reading experience didn't matter. If it wasn't the experience shared by the person who wrote the answers our teacher read us, it was wrong. It was a game, and I intuitively knew that it was limiting me. It wasn't until my girlfriend Valentina and I broke up that I began to read on my own time. Gone were the days of picking from a curated list of books. I didn't want to read Jane Austen or Sylvia Plath or George Orwell. I wanted to read Tucker Max, Charles Bukowski, and Dennis Lehane. I wanted to learn about poker, to find stories that more closely represented how I was feeling at the time. Angry, alone, and misunderstood. When I followed my curiosity, I flew through books. I stayed up all night and read instead of watching movies. I stopped going out to nightclubs and went to bed early so I could spend my weekend mornings reading on the beach. Despite being ostracized from most of my friends after the breakup, I remember the last few months of high school as one of the best summers of my life, all because I had found reading. In a way, books are what awakened me to the generational trauma I inherited. Without them, I would have stayed in Cancun, wasted away playing video games, getting drunk, being a monster to women, and thinking I could get away with it forever. What follows is a list of books that transformed my life in some way. I've listed them in the order that I read them. Read the ones that speak to you, and leave the rest behind. Charles Bukowski, Ham on Rye, Post Office, Factotum, Women, and Hollywood. As a teen going on young adult, I'd lived a very sheltered life. Not sheltered from violence, drug and alcohol abuse, lies, sex, crime, or power. I was sheltered from the tools someone that age needs in order to become autonomous. I'd never had a real job. I'd never cooked a meal that wasn't microwavable. I didn't do my own laundry. I never changed the oil in my car or fixed a flat tire. I'd only heard of the word emotion in movies and TV. At 18, with college looming, I didn't know what I didn't know. That was the only reason I applied to college. It was hammered into me that all other roads lead to a dismal future, and those roads seemed abstract because I'd never experienced them. College, on the other hand, made sense to me. You have your dorm, there's a cafeteria and laundry room within walking distance, you go to class, you make friends, you join a sports team, you do drugs and go to parties, you graduate and get a job doing something you hate. If your parents can afford it, they pay for everything. Otherwise, you take out loans you spend the rest of your life paying off. That was my path until I read Bukowski. Granted, he's not exactly a role model, but at the time, he was my only frame of reference for a non-college path. Despite the misery that he endured, for my level of consciousness at that age, it didn't seem all that different to my own life. Reading Bukowski was the first time in my life that I seriously considered pursuing writing and a middle to lower class life in California. I could find odd jobs just to make ends meet and write in my off time. A life that simple seemed to me a whole lot better than another 4 years of school. 7 years later, my admiration for Bukowski is gone. I see him not as a great writer who acted courageously, but as a coward who was so comforted by words that he became a slave to them. I would have hated Bukowski if I'd met him. However, I can still learn from another man's misery. Tucker Max, I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell, Assholes Finish First, and Hilarity Ensues. Although his real impact came later in my life, Tucker's fratire books put into words a feeling I'd had for most of my early life, that very few people tell the full truth, and those who do are targeted by cowards who don't. W. Timothy Galloway, The Inner Game of Tennis. This was one of my first times learning about the concept of a monkey mind, self-doubt, self-consciousness, etc. I struggled with judging everything I did, and this offered me a framework for how and why to fix it. Robert A. Glover, No More Mr. Nice Guy. The most prevalent dynamic in my family has always been to give so you can take. My dad let me drive his cars in high school, but threatened to take away the privilege any time I refused to do something for him. My mom spent a week with me in Valentina when we visited her for Christmas, only to hold it against me when I didn't do what she wanted me to do. Before I read this book, I had no idea why. I didn't know there was a name for this behavior. All I knew was that it felt terrible and that I had developed my fair share of those tendencies. Nice guy syndrome is when I'm nice to others in an attempt to control them. It is the quickest and surest way to ruin any relationship. Randy Pausch, The Last Lecture. Randy was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and given a few months to live. His children were so young that he realized he wouldn't be around to teach them all the lessons he had learned in his short life. So instead, he wrote this book. Brené Brown, Daring Greatly. A great read on vulnerability and self-compassion. Viktor E. Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. Written by a Holocaust survivor, this details how meaning saved his life and how it can save yours. Alain de Botton, The Consolations of Philosophy. Ancient philosophers' wisdom distilled into this digestible read. I Love Everything by Alain de Botton. Religion for Atheists, Status Anxiety, On Love, and The Course of Love are some of my favorites. Michael A. Singer, The Untethered Soul. This helped me start thinking outside the box as far as my own consciousness goes. For an easier read that covers many of the same themes, read Singer's The Surrender Experiment. Javon McCormick, I Got There. Javon's story inspired me to be a better man and showed me what the path to get there looks like. Tucker Max and Jeffrey Miller, Mate, Become the Man Women Want. Leading up to the book launch, the authors recorded hundreds of podcast episodes they released under the name The Mating Grounds. For best results, listen to the podcast and then read the book. They have a 40-plus episode series called Helping Joe that not only changed my life, but remains the funniest podcast I have ever listened to. Without the podcast and book, I wouldn't be where I am today. My brother and I often joke that it's like our Bible, except that it taught us how to think, not what to think. David Goggins, Can't Hurt Me. I've talked at length about this book already, so I won't repeat myself. Just remember to listen to the audiobook. It's not the same without Goggins' commentary after each chapter. Nick Sheff, Tweak. Reading Tweak gave me the courage to write my own memoir. I felt less alone during the loneliest month of my life because of it. Philip McKernan, One Last Talk. The foundational truth in this book is that the most impactful thing I can do is share my story. It doesn't matter who I am, what I've been through, or where I'm going. There's at least one other person in the world like me, and by sharing my story with them, I'm potentially saving their life. Robert Bly, Iron John. Possibly the most underrated book in my entire list. Ichiro Kishimi, The Courage to Be Disliked. A young student and a wise man have recurring meetings to discuss deep philosophical questions. If it's important to you that others perceive you as nice, this is a must-read. An Other, Trust, Surrender, Receive. This book offers case study after case study of traumatized individuals who participated in psychedelic therapy sessions that changed their lives. I learned more about trauma from this book than I have for most others. I also felt deeply consoled by how each of these horrifying case studies ended. There is hope for the hopeless. Alice Miller, The Drama of the Gifted Child. Warning: after reading this, you will never look at your childhood in the same way again. Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. The more I find books written by young kids, the more I realize that they hold the deepest truths, because kids haven't developed the defense mechanisms that often prevent us from seeing the truth. Anne Frank's diary is full of truths. Aaron Tyler, The Bad One. One of the most unique representations of trauma ever created. Quan Nguyen, Sparrow in the Razor Wire. Equal parts moving and disturbing, this holds the kind of universal wisdom that books these days rarely do. David R. Hawkins, Letting Go. My life is no longer the same after reading this. Everything I thought was true no longer is. Gabor Mate, When the Body Says No. This book focuses on the relationship between disease and emotions. It's case study after case study of people with severe or terminal illnesses and their backstories. The central theme is that your illness is your body's way of putting a stop to the neglect you've allowed yourself to endure. And if you start paying closer attention to those needs, your healing can speed up. Eric Jorgensen, The Almanac of Naval Ravikant. A neat and powerful collection of lessons from one of the world's wisest modern-day philosophers. It's free to read in ebook format. Just go to navalmanac.com to download a copy. And finally, a small list of books I read after I wrote this book. Mark Wolin, It Didn't Start With You. Gabor Mate, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. Cindy Finch, When Grief is Good. Dr. Nicole Lepera, How to Do the Work. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. Dr. Dan Engel, A Dose of Hope. Chapter 36, Mentors and Role Models. In ordinary life, a mentor can guide a young man through various disciplines, helping to bring him out of boyhood into manhood. And that, in turn, is associated not with bodybuilding, but with building an emotional body capable of containing more than one sort of ecstasy. Robert Bly, Iron John, A Book About Men. Growing up, I learned the way of the world from friends, which sounds romantic but is actually very detrimental. When it's our friends instead of our parents or other adults in our community, we can end up in gangs, become violent at a young age, and harbor negative feelings towards society as a whole. We can feel outcast. My parents tried to teach me about the world, but they were so lost that it soon became clear to me their teachings were only hurting me, creating fear and lack of trust. Their friends and the other adults in my community did the same when they weren't strictly trying to manipulate me into following their rules. It wasn't my world they were teaching me about. It was theirs. I was to tailor my likes and dislikes to fit within their comfort zone. With friends, it was the opposite. At 13, I learned that a new friend of mine had lost his virginity to one of his cousins. He told me the story and I began to desire a girl I could lose my virginity to. That it was his cousin never registered in my mind as a problem because another 13-year-old had told me the story, and I never bothered to check with the adults because I didn't trust them anymore. In fact, around that age was when I first became conscious of the fact that I was alone in the world. I had just moved back to Cancun from the Bay Area and was living with my dad and my brother in a downtown apartment. I didn't speak to or see my mom much, and I only saw my dad at night because we slept in the same bed together. Sometimes he wouldn't come home, and I wouldn't know why. As this feeling cemented itself in my soul, fear continued to grow in me. How was I going to figure things out alone? What would happen if I didn't? There were so many questions I had, and I didn't know any of the answers. So I escaped from responsibility and growth. I watched TV and hung out with friends. I desperately sought out girls and developed crushes on them so I wouldn't have to be alone. These are not inherently evil things, but they became my crutches. And it's because of how I learned to engage with them that I still struggle to set appropriate boundaries. If I'm going through a hard time, or if there's a feeling I don't want to feel, these are my distractions. The flip side is that because these behaviors helped me survive in the past, I now know that when I engage in them compulsively, there's a part of me that feels like it needs to survive the present. So I know to check in and consciously address the discomfort. The only reason I became aware of this was because toward the end of high school, I sought out other adults to relearn the world from. There came a time when the way I had learned to live was no longer serving me. I needed a change. When I began my journey, I wasn't aware of the risks involved in seeking help from strangers, like people who exploit insecurities to make money. As I grow older, I realize the importance of listening to my intuition. In order to distinguish between helpful and unhelpful, honest and dishonest, I've had to practice letting in what I need and letting go of what no longer serves me. Everyone I include in this chapter shaped my life in some way. Without these mentors and role models, I honestly don't know what my life would look like today. I may never have written this book, or any of my other books. I may never have told Kiki the truth. I may never have found the courage to begin fully accepting myself. Direction. Before I moved to Austin, I listened to the Helping Joe podcast that I mentioned earlier. It was a group of 3 friends, Tucker, Niels, and Charlie, coming together once a week to help an average Joe with his dating life in Austin, Texas. Through this series, I learned about what life in Austin is like. It's one of the healthiest cities in the US. Jobs are abundant. More women live here than men. The arts are an important part of the culture. I knew what I was going to find and who I could become if I started a life here. A lot of terrible things happened that first year. My roommate died of a heroin overdose. I was in a serious bicycle accident. I got fired from a job I loved because the owner's wife had a grudge against me. But not once did I feel like my move had been a mistake, because I was finally making my own decisions. I learned that my aversion to failure came from my parents' fears and my fear of disappointing them. Bumps in the road became my greatest teacher. Before the podcast, I didn't know where I was going or how I would get there. I wanted to be a professional poker player and a writer, but I didn't know how or why. I buried myself deeper and deeper in my desire of those titles every time someone close to me told me it wouldn't happen. It wasn't until I learned from people who had no stake in what I did with my life and only wanted to help me improve it that I began asking myself those questions. What do I want? Why do I want it? Who do I want? Who don't I want? What am I good at? What am I not good at? The reason I emphasize the importance of this podcast in my life is because it didn't tell me what to think. It taught me how to think. Of course, everyone has their biases and traumas that shape the way they think and the things they talk about. My parents do, Tucker, Niels, and Charlie do, and so do I. The goal was never to find someone with an objective truth, free from emotional baggage, because I don't believe such a thing exists. What I needed was to find people living the life that I wanted to build, and then take from them what served me and discard the rest. Anytime Tucker, Niels, or Charlie shared a lesson they learned, I thought, these guys are funny, healthy, and honest. These guys are examples of the kind of man I want to become. Their lessons will help me get to where I want to go. Let me say it one more time because it's easy to misconstrue this. I am not learning their lessons, reading the books they recommend, or listening to their podcast because they belong to a group that I have tied my identity to. I am not taking everything they say as the gospel and pitting myself against everyone who doesn't agree with them. I continue to engage with and learn from the people that I do only because I have proven to myself that it serves me. This isn't about picking sides or learning from someone because they voted for the same person that I did. It's about finding direction and then discerning what serves me and what doesn't, and being brutally honest with myself while doing that. Compassion. I always say that if people's physical appearance matched their emotional age, human behavior would be a lot easier to understand. Gabor Mate. I used to think that I was sick and addicted. Secretly, I craved the labels. I thought if I found ones that matched my behavior, it would fix everything. Mom also used to suggest that I might be bipolar since, from her perspective, Dad had bipolar tendencies. I search Gabor's name on YouTube every now and then, hoping to find a new podcast appearance of his. His book, When the Body Says No, transformed the way I view disease. In the realm of hungry ghosts, transformed the way I view addiction. His work is one of the reasons I stopped seeking an easy way out through labels. Gabor says we can't understand addiction or addictive behavior without understanding the relief it provides us with. For me, the word addiction and disease are interchangeable in that sentence. The reason I wanted to be labeled bipolar was because it's not my doing if it can all be chalked up to a chemical imbalance. The same goes for when I get sick. Instead of seeing my cold or fever as a sign that my body feels neglected, I used to say I got sick because then it wasn't my responsibility. Through Gabor's teachings, I have reframed most of my problems as coping mechanisms. This subtle reframe allows for compassion to exist where before there was judgment. What I called problems were actually solutions at one point in my life. Suppressing my emotions helped me get by in a family where emotions were never regulated. So when it happens in present day, it may no longer be serving me, because I am no longer dependent on that family. But that doesn't mean that it's a problem. It's simply an old solution to an otherwise unsolvable problem. Compassion is the most effective way for me to heal. Every time I slip up, I can forgive and understand, rather than blame and shame. Blame and shame keep me stuck and create more wounds. Compassion mends wounds and offers me an opportunity to try again. Asking the right question. In 2020, I was fortunate enough to have a conversation with Philip McKernan on my podcast. I asked him for feedback on a matter about my dad. I had reason for concern over my father's health at the time. My question to Philip was this: should I move back home to spend what could potentially be the last few years of my dad's life with him? Philip helped me recognize that I was using that question to avoid asking myself a harder one. If he died tomorrow morning, what regrets would you have around your dad? My answer, in short, was that I never shared my truth with him, that I never had the conversation everyone wishes they had before their parent passed away. 2 months later, I flew home to have that conversation with him. Our relationship has never been better. More on this in chapter 39. Ownership. I'm in prison for the murder of another human being. That was Quan Nguyen's response during an interview for NPR. As soon as he said it and saw the look on the reporter's face, everything in him wanted to explain to her why he had murdered another human being. He wanted to give context, but he didn't. Instead, he sat with the discomfort and let go of his need for control. After all, Quan admits that in 1999, when he killed this man, it was because he wanted to. This is how Quan came to be a free man again, literally and figuratively. He was released from prison because he took full ownership of his actions during his parole hearing. He released himself of the shame and eternal guilt when he accepted that he was the one who had killed another human being, not his past. And it was through this newfound sense of ownership that he realized only he could change his circumstances. Whether or not we're in prison, I believe this lesson can apply to anyone. The core question I addressed to learn this lesson is, how did I end up here? When I cheated on Kiki, this question and the answer to it echoed in my head for 3 months. Kiki was the third partner I had been with, and the third partner I had cheated on. In baseball, 3 strikes mean you're out. I don't watch baseball, but the metaphor weighed heavy on me. I felt I had made the same mistake 3 times and that it was time for me to be out of the game. I no longer felt like I had a road to redemption. How did I end up here? If you had asked me that 2 years ago, I would have told you that it was hard for me to accept Kiki's love because I never felt loved by my parents. So because of my conditioning, I sabotaged the relationship. Telling you this would have been my way of controlling the situation and deflecting ownership. The truth is that I cheated on Kiki because I wanted to hurt her. Accepting this wasn't easy. It meant accepting that I'm capable of causing deep pain in the hearts of people I love. But accepting it also meant that I'm capable of changing that narrative. If I did it because of my past, I'm at the end of the road because I can't change my past. But if I did it because I wanted to do it, I can learn new behaviors instead. Kwan wasn't born a murderer, and I wasn't born a cheater. Nobody is born this way. If I can become the kind of man that cheats, I can also become the kind of man that doesn't. The way to do that is through ownership. Boundaries. In her memoir, The Bad One, Erin Tyler wrote about her abusive family who scapegoated her for her entire life. I was curious to learn more about what her relationship to them looked like in present day and how she had gotten there. In that context, one of the questions I asked her was, what did forgiveness look like for you? This is what she had to say, redacted from a 2-minute clip. Forgiveness to me just seems like lip service, like something you say because you're supposed to say it. I think empathy always is my track. My parents had terrible childhoods. They had trauma. They had never been loved. I understand why they did what they did. I understand why now they get angry with me. I understand why my sister is who she is. I get it. And I try to maintain that empathy always. But boundaries always too. Because anyone that comes between you and yourself needs to get the hell out of your life. If you don't have those boundaries, then you don't have that empathy with yourself. And so when people transgress and they cross those boundaries, pull back. They don't get to access you like that. Love them, but love them at a distance so that you can love you too. Hearing this was the first time since cutting off communication with my mom and sister that I considered the possibility of one day speaking to them again. It reframed boundaries and put me back in the driver's seat. When I called my mom the last time before cutting her off, I was calling to wish her a happy birthday. At this point, we'd had numerous conversations about my memoir and about my past. I had established what I needed from her, which was nothing more than for her to listen. For whatever reason, it was too difficult for her to do that. So by the time we had our final phone call, and she decided to cross my boundary again, I realized I needed to set a stricter one, which unfortunately meant not interacting with her at all. However, when I reached out to them years later, I felt much stronger. My boundary, which was for us to not speak or see each other at all, had only been crossed once. The boundary had been working with both her and my sister, so the idea of softening it some wasn't out of the question anymore. I was no longer afraid of reaching out to them because I knew that if I needed to, I could always pull back again. One of the reasons I lost sight of this as an option was because I was afraid that they would use it against me in the future, the way they did when I was little. As a kid, I often heard the phrase, "So you're just going to give me the silent treatment now?" I grew ashamed of my attempt at setting boundaries. So as I entered adult life, I developed the belief that it would be better to never talk to someone again than to stop and consider reopening dialogue at a later time. This belief belongs to my mom. I get to set whatever boundaries I want, and I get to adjust them however I see fit. But her belief was so ingrained in me as my own that it was only through relearning from Erin that I was able to correct it and go back to the one that was working before. I had forgotten what I already knew and needed a role model to rediscover it. Chapter 37. Creatures of Creativity. No one is born more creative or not creative at all. Creativity is fostered, first by those we depend on, then from within. It can look very different depending on life circumstances. Humans born into chaotic environments find creative ways to survive. Humans born into stable environments find creative ways to express. In my early life, creating was how I coped with difficult feelings. When I had my first girlfriend in elementary school, the fear I felt after I left school every day was unbearable. To cope, I wrote and illustrated love letters to her. At the same time, I relied on creativity to cope with being alone. My family and I spent hours at a time every day in our bedrooms, away from each other. Faced with these hours of time to myself, I learned to draw, to write, to paint, and to play group sports, like soccer, by myself. When I lived with only Dad and Todd, I became so lonely that I stopped creating, and instead sought out the company of video games or strange men from the internet. It wasn't until my senior year of high school and freshman year of college that I revisited creativity. My English teacher, Megan, and my college professors, Sean and Raymond, encouraged me to write. That tiny nod from those three people was all I needed to believe in myself again. Having built my life around creativity for the past 9 years, I've come to realize the importance of it in adult life. Creativity is art, film, language, technological innovation, emotional realization. Creativity is how I change narratives, because without it, I'm stuck projecting old ones onto my present. One of my favorite movies on creativity is called Brigsby Bear. It's about a man who wants to make a movie about his favorite childhood TV show, Brigsby Bear, while everyone around him tells him he needs to move on and grow up. This is my favorite quote from it. Everyone says they're trying to help me, but nobody can find me the new episode of Brigsby. It's an accurate representation of what society conditions us to believe as we grow older. We grow worried that we're not figuring things out soon enough, or preoccupied with amassing money so we can one day feel safe. We drink ourselves to death because we hate our jobs but are too afraid to consider other paths. We kill our dreams because we want to fit in, because we are afraid of being abandoned or rejected for showing the world who we really are. Meanwhile, everyone and everything around us encourages this and claims it's for our own good, which teaches us that our innate curiosity must be wrong because it's going against what's good for us. I know so many people that have amazing talents but only ever talk about them. It took me years to start my own podcast, to perform stand-up and improv comedy, to sing at karaoke night, to publish my writing, to make short films, to do the things that I was naturally curious and excited about because I was terrified of how others would react. But nobody ever told me that pursuing those things might be what's good for me. Nobody wants to be the person that encourages someone to follow their dream because we fear that if the person tries and then fails, they will be mad at us, or that it will somehow be our fault. We never stop to think about what's on the other side of that. A life without purpose, pursued to please others. I don't care what your dreams are. There's a version of them that can come true. Curiosity over fear. When I first set out to write short stories, I didn't plan on publishing them. When I decided to record the audiobook for my first memoir, I didn't expect to start a podcast from it. When I bought a $1,000 phone to take better pictures with, I didn't anticipate that I would use it to start a YouTube channel. Most of my creative endeavors happened because I listened to my curiosity over my fear. In the months leading up to the publication of my first memoir, I met with my friend Kyler. I mentioned that I had an idea for a book trailer. He lit up and offered to help in any way he could. As I left the bar, I remember thinking that he'd probably offered because he wanted to be nice. If I emailed him to set something up, he was going to feel burdened. My fear tried to override my lived experience. Besides, even if we did film the trailer, it would expose everyone to my prostitution days in a visual medium, and that scared the hell out of me. I drew a storyboard with stick figures and emailed it to Kyler along with a budget. My fear didn't go away. I just chose not to let it keep me from starting. I wasn't afraid to create the trailer, I was afraid to share it, and I could always choose not to. A few days later, Kyler sent me a very enthusiastic email. Before long, we had cast 2 of the 3 roles. I reached out to an actor friend of mine and pitched him the 3rd role. "I want you to play me in it," I said. I showed him the same storyboard I sent Kyler. My friend looked at my drawings of a young man meeting up with an old man in a motel room and their short exchange before they parted ways. When he finished inspecting it, he looked resigned, but was too afraid to say no. He just said, "I've got a couple things coming up, but I'll definitely reach out to you and let you know soon." I texted him a week later and he responded that he wasn't interested in playing the role of a male prostitute. When he said that, all of my shame and fear came roaring back. My friend, an actor, someone whose job it is to pretend, didn't want to pretend he was a prostitute, and yet I had actually been one. On the day of the shoot, I met Kyler at the motel an hour before the actors arrived. I frantically edited lines as he set up the lights. We chatted briefly about the shoot and dealing with the actors, and before I was ready, they arrived. Kyler did introductions and gave everyone a general breakdown of what to expect, and then handed the reins over to me. I gulped nervously, holding my stick figure storyboard in hand, and directed the actors. During the actual filming portion, I held the boom mic and watched this scene I had lived so many times before play out in front of me. After each take, I talked to the actors and explained to them what I was feeling in these moments. I emphasized the importance of this trailer by briefly explaining to them the sad reality of male prostitution and telling them who this was for. I didn't realize it then, but I was saying all of this for me as much as I was for them. I needed to reframe my past. It was the first time I spoke about my experiences with passion instead of shame. These people weren't my family or friends. I wasn't ever going to see them again. They just needed me to step up in order to do their job. There was no judgment. When I watched Kyler's final cut for the first time, my face beamed with pride. Not only was this past I'd been so ashamed of transformed into a work of art, but I had also officially been part of a professional film. As soon as it was finished, no longer ashamed, I showed the trailer to my brother, to coworkers who knew nothing about my past, and to my therapist. I didn't even stop to think about how they would react. I knew how I felt about it, and that was all that mattered to me. I had followed my natural curiosity, and by doing so, let go of my fear. By letting go of my fear, I created an opportunity to demonstrate courage. And by demonstrating courage, I developed self-confidence and self-trust. The best part of it all is that this book trailer wasn't the only thing that came of it. After the shoot, I asked Kyler if I could use a call room in his co-working space to record my audiobook. In recording it, I realized I enjoyed talking into a microphone and telling stories from my past. So, one night I decided to go off script and record an hour-long podcast doing exactly that. The next night I did the same thing. Before I knew it, I had recorded 5 episodes and picked a name. I began publishing my podcast, and in less than a year, I started having guests on it. people that I never dreamed I would get the opportunity to talk to. I also had a platform that I could use to lift up my friends and help them speak their truths. By getting comfortable talking into a microphone and being in front of a camera, I let go of another fear and followed my filmmaking curiosity. When the lockdowns hit in March of 2020, I used my newfound time to record short films. I recorded dozens of them. Then, new ideas came to me about different videos I could make, and I made my first YouTube video. My takeaway is this: where there is fear, there is curiosity. Where there is curiosity, there's a barrier to entry. If I can lower the barrier to entry, I can follow my curiosity without any fear at all. Chapter 38. The Why and Where of Meaning. In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. Viktor E. Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. Meaning exists whether or not I make the conscious choice to accept it into my life. There is meaning in the suffering every Holocaust survivor endured. There is meaning in the trauma stored within rape victims' bodies. There is meaning in the torturous childhoods endured by men and women who were abused by their parents. I used to think that my life had no meaning. Instead of using meaning as my North Star, I unconsciously made decisions that I hoped would lead to fame and recognition. I wanted to prove myself to people, mainly my parents, and find my worth that way. This mental framework helped propel my writing and work ethic. I wrote and published 4 books in 3 years. I was given a raise and a promotion at all of my jobs within a month of starting them. Output became my religion. So long as I was a slave to it, I felt good about myself. I stopped going out with my improv buddies after class because I had to write instead. I created conflict in my romantic relationships so I could have an excuse to pull back from my partner and create more time to write. I never fully allowed myself to enjoy spending time with friends because I saw it as a waste of time I could have used to create more. Suffering was all I knew, and I was suffering a lot. The meaning I've found in my life today existed then too. The only difference now is my awareness of it. It grew exponentially the more that I suffered, until I couldn't suffer any longer. Only after that happened, when I'd had one too many nights of despair and loneliness, was I able to accept what I'd been growing aware of. That everything I've lived through taught me a lesson I needed to learn. That there are people out there like me who feel the way that I do, who need to hear what I needed to hear. That they are not alone either. My ego doesn't like to hear that. It's afraid to accept that I could be the one others need to hear so as not to feel alone, because that means no longer hiding who I really am. And by doing that, I put myself at risk of rejection, failure, embarrassment, abandonment, you name it. My ego pushes acceptance away by flooding me with fear. What makes me so special that others might want to hear what I have to say? Who the hell do I think I am? There is a greater risk of insert fear happening when I stop hiding who I really am. But when I take the risk anyway, and by doing so, help at least one other person on this planet to stop suffering, that's meaning. Diary as legacy. 2 months after my last ketamine infusion, panic spread over a COVID-19 virus. Countries shut down. Websites with case numbers and death counts popped up. And many of our civil liberties, like freedom of assembly and religion, were taken from us. The social think quickly became, stay home to stay safe. Almost overnight, my sense of security vanished. My hours were cut, and my job at risk of fully going away. Coworkers and friends lost their jobs. Some people moved back in with their parents, and many of the places I frequented began to shut down for good. I remember riding my bike home from work the first night on empty streets. Most businesses closed or boarded up. Austin was a ghost town. Tears welled up in my eyes as I coasted down an empty, rainy street. What would happen to all of the people whose lives depended on these jobs? And would I soon become one of them? Around this same time, I finished reading Anne Frank's The Diary of a Young Girl. Here was this teenage girl caught in the midst of a world war, confined to a small space, scarce food, and horrifying news. Yet she kept the faith that there would be a better tomorrow. I couldn't help but draw a parallel between the events she endured and the events I feared I was about to. I felt hopeless at the beginning of the lockdowns. I was afraid that I would run out of money and have to return to Mexico to live with my dad, uprooting the last 5 years of the life I had built in Austin. Living in this state of fear, I began to feel like a victim. That's why I decided to start The Diary of a Young Man. Using Anne Frank as my inspiration, on March 17th of 2020, I wrote my first diary entry. I wrote about what was happening, how I was feeling, and what I was doing about it. The diary gave me purpose and turned my suffering into meaning. By documenting my experience, I felt I was leaving behind a record that others, perhaps future members of my family, could one day turn to for the same kind of inspiration that Anne Frank's diary provided me with. Maybe you think my diary, or potentially starting your own, will never compare to Anne Frank's diary. Maybe you think her story is more important because it was read by millions and published by a big publishing company. In your mind, it's no longer just a young girl's diary. Anne Frank is not just a young girl to you. She's a historical figure that will forever be revered. Except that all of that came after her death. Anne Frank died an anonymous young girl. She didn't start her diary to help anyone. She probably would have cringed at the thought that the whole world would read it one day. Anne Frank was no different than you and me. All she did was turn her suffering into meaning by writing about what happened and how she felt about it. 3 levels of honesty. There are 3 levels to sharing my experience honestly. First is with loved ones. Second is sharing publicly. And third is sharing privately with myself. Fear exists in all 3. When I share with loved ones, I fear what they'll think. When I share publicly, I fear the impact it can have on my reputation. When I share with myself, I fear no longer being able to hide. After I published my first memoir, I relapsed on my coping behavior of promiscuous sex with strange men from the internet. I didn't tell my loved ones because I was afraid they would judge me. I didn't share this with the internet because I thought they wouldn't want to hear from me anymore. And I didn't journal about it at first because I didn't want it to be true. A few weeks went by. I started to feel depressed. I tried to fix my depression by busying myself with work, friends, and creative projects. It didn't work. I knew there was something I was running from and that this was the root of my depression. I wasn't being honest with myself. Finally, I wrote about my relapse. I grit my teeth as I did because I wanted to believe that I'd overcome the pain that compelled me to give a strange man a blowjob. I wanted that part of me to be in the past, but it wasn't, and writing it down on paper made it real. Being honest about my lived experiences isn't always easy. Sometimes I need a soft place to land after a hard wake-up call. Sometimes telling a loved one about it isn't the best way to start because they may not be able to hold space for it. Sometimes sharing it on social media isn't the best idea if I haven't done the work to accept it myself. We live in a world where most people are afraid to tell the truth and be honest about who they really are. It doesn't help that my brain is literally hardwired to fool me as a coping mechanism. Learning how to identify my lies makes me better at understanding my truth. Understanding my truth then allows me to act from a place of openness to my whole self, not the self I want my family to love, my friends to invite out to social gatherings, or the internet to praise. Once I accepted my relapse, I was strong enough to share it with others. I regained the courage that realigned me with my purpose, which is to help people in pain by sharing my story, not to pretend that I'm not in pain so that others will feel more isolated in theirs. My suffering, the relapse, I had now turned into a meaningful experience. Chapter 39. Rewriting Old Narratives. The first therapist I ever went to told me to find the inner child in others in order to fully understand them. It took me years to internalize this, and it takes a hell of a lot of work to be mindful of it every day. But it's true. Next time you get into an argument with someone, try to really notice their facial expressions. What you'll find is the face of a hurt child. Finding someone's inner child means seeing through their mask, one they may or may not know they're wearing. I can apply the same principle to myself. In order to see through my mask, I first have to accept that I'm wearing one and understand why that is. It can be scary to accept that I've been wearing a mask, but here's the thing. We all wear masks. A mask protects me from having to relive painful experiences from the past. It's the lie I tell myself about why I don't want to dance at the party or hug my father and tell him that I love him. It's a feeling that invades me so subtly that I forget to notice it. It can comfort me when I'm scared. It's my biggest blind side to growth, and it manifests in behaviors like being too afraid to say the words, "I don't know," judging others harshly, lying about what I want, or expecting myself to be perfect. Part of taking off the mask is going back to when I was hurt and writing a new ending. I do this by witnessing my inner child when I can and listening to his needs the way that my parents didn't. If I wake up one day and I feel like I need to take a day to just exist, I do. I listen to the judgmental voice I internalized that tells me I shouldn't be lazy or weak. Then I think, if a 5-year-old child told me they needed this, how would I respond? I would take them seriously and help them meet their needs. The stories I share in this chapter are about needs I had that I wasn't meeting. There are moments in my life where I rewrote endings. A lot of these needs used to make me cringe. I was ashamed of needing love, play, and grief. Had I continued to ignore and belittle these needs, I never would have rewritten these endings. Meeting my inner child. During a trip to Illinois in the summer of 2020, I met a 5-year-old kid named Sean. He was the youngest of 3. Sean was the son of a kind-hearted man with a drinking problem. Sean's father was a religious man, his faith having helped him to get his life back on track. He was recently married, and his wife was out of town when I visited. The family lived in a small town in the Midwest. I stayed with them for a week. Because of the lockdowns, the kids weren't going to school and the father wasn't working, so we spent every day of that week together. When Sean first met me, he hid behind his father's legs. He was curious, but shy. I could tell he was sizing me up. Throughout that day, anytime I called Sean's name or tried to play with him, he'd run away and hide. Then he'd peek from a corner to see if I was still engaged with him. The next morning I woke up to Sean and his older brother, Rowan, hitting me with pillows and shooting me with their toy guns. I got up and fought back. I picked them up and tossed them on the bed. I pretended that they killed me. I pretended to kill them. I chased them and was chased by them. We did this for nearly 1 hour before I got tired and had to stop. From that moment on, Sean and I were like best friends. Now, instead of running away from me when I called his name, he approached me and handed me a pillow. Then he ran back to where he grabbed the pillow from and grabbed another one. "What's this for?" I asked. Instead of using his words, he started to hit me with his pillow. Other times he approached me and brought one of his books with him. He didn't ask me if I wanted to read it. He just handed me the book and sat next to me on the couch. "You want me to read it to you?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, a big smile on his face. Sean tried to repeat the words I read from the book back to me. When he had trouble with words, I stopped and repeated them several times before moving on. He repeated them with me and always laughed after failing to get them right. Reading was my favorite activity to do with Sean. Sometimes, Rowan interrupted our reading by smashing one of us with a pillow or swinging his plastic sword at us. Whereas I got startled, Sean jumped off the couch and ran to grab a weapon he could defend himself with. Then the two of them fought until they tired or until Sean started to cry. There were several times when this happened where I was the only adult around. Rowan would eventually hit Sean a little too hard, and Sean would start fighting for real, his face red with frustration. But Rowan was old enough that Sean never got to hurt him back. Instead, Sean cried in defeat. The first time I saw Sean cry like this, I asked what happened and if he was okay. He didn't respond. I asked him a second time. Still nothing. Frustrated, I stopped asking and just sat there with him until he got up and started running around again like nothing happened. I did this 2 more times before I realized what was happening. Every time I asked Sean how he felt, he didn't respond because he didn't know how to. The reason it frustrated me was because it reflected back to me my own inability to express my emotions, and now, also my inability to help someone else express theirs. When it happened a 4th time and he didn't respond, I said, "Are you hurt?" He nodded yes. "Are you sad because Rowan hurt you?" I said. He nodded yes again. A light bulb went off in my head. My first aha moment with a child. Young children need help identifying what emotion they're feeling so that they can then let go of the emotion. Because I never learned how to do this, when I asked Sean how he felt, I thought that was enough for him to express his emotion. I didn't know I had skipped a step. I saw how easy it is for hurt children to repeat the patterns that hurt them. Had I not reflected on why I wasn't getting through to Sean and tried a different approach, I could have grown to see his being hurt as a problem because of how inadequate I would have felt being unable to help him. A problem child is born out of his or her parents' inability to guide him. By labeling the child a problem, the parents solve an unsolvable situation and rationalize away their responsibility. Like if I had said to myself, "I asked Sean how he felt. It's not my fault he doesn't want to talk about it." It wasn't about fault. It was about a child not knowing what they didn't know. I felt a deep connection to Sean for the rest of my stay. I saw myself in so many of the things he did and didn't do. I felt bad for him because his father didn't always know how to be there for him. I wondered if Sean would grow up to be like me in some ways. And because I felt all of this, I tried my best to leave a lasting memory in him of what empathy feels like. What I didn't expect was for Sean to leave the same with me. Each time I didn't ask him the right questions. Each time I said no to a pillow fight. Each time I was too stressed about work to read to him. Sean didn't get mad or shame me. He accepted me more than I accepted myself. Through my relationship with Sean, I learned how to interact with my inner child. Part of healing my inner child is learning how to treat myself as one. Literally. When I'm having a hard time feeling sadness or grief, when my energy is drained because I forgot to set boundaries, when I'm doing things to prove my worth, this is when I need it most. It's about changing the default operating mode, which is to be hard on myself, and learning to be compassionate and understanding of the fact that I don't know what I don't know. It's about coming back to myself every time, no matter what. Like Sean, it's about accepting when I'm not feeling up for it and coming back the next day with a pillow in hand, ready to try again. Change. When I started writing this book, I lived in an apartment with my brother and his dog, Ellie. In the years that we lived together, I was in 3 serious relationships. I wrote my first memoir, and I developed a close friendship with my neighbor, Ernesto. I know how silly it sounds because I judged myself for saying it way before anyone else could, but the apartment represented more than just a place for me to live. It represented everything I had done in Austin up to that point. Making the decision to move out was tough. It was like losing a folder full of pictures that aren't backed up. I would have to let go of a lot of memories. Staying, on the other hand, didn't feel like an option anymore. I'd wanted to move out and postponed it for the past 2 years. Our kitchen had a roach infestation. Our AC unit broke down once a week. We received emails once a month about dangerous trespassers on the property and break-ins to neighbors' cars. Furthermore, everything about the apartment reminded me of Kiki. The blue stain on my floor from when she painted while I wrote. The walk-in closet we had tons of sex in. The view from my bedroom window out at the parking lot, where so many times I watched her arrive, excited to see me, or leave, devastated by the most recent fight we'd had. I was terrified of losing these abstract representations because part of me still didn't want to let go of Kiki. Leaving, or moving on, has never been easy for me. I am much better at convincing myself of all the reasons I shouldn't than I am at accepting the reasons why I eventually will anyway. Change happens whether or not I want it to. When I accept it, I heal from it and adapt to a new normal. When I fight it, the external change still happens, but the internal one doesn't. Change is a reminder of unfelt pain. When my family moved out of our childhood home, though it forever changed us and my idea of security, I suppressed that knowledge because it was too painful for me to feel at the time. And that suppressed pain came back up when I moved out of the apartment with my brother. That little kid who felt terrified of leaving his nest at age 11 showed up to tell me he was terrified of leaving his new nest at age 24. That little kid served as a wake-up call for me to have a proper goodbye this time. I used to think we only grieved death, breakups, and failure. Now I see that those are the 3 that come to mind because they are the most painful. Grief encompasses everything. Leaving a job, losing a phone, graduating high school, dropping out of college, the end of a vacation, selling a car, entering puberty, losing your virginity, getting sober, moving out, moving away. I have experienced all of those and more. Each time, my instinct has been to push the pain away and focus on a solution. Sometimes I push it away so much that I don't even recognize it exists. When I dropped out of college, I was so focused on what came next that I forgot to tell any of the friends I'd made about my decision. When I lost my first computer, I was more concerned with buying another one than I was with the hundreds of photos and videos I had lost forever. In the month leading up to the move, I made time to feel sad that I was leaving a space that had given me so much. I remember coming home from a walk one day and sitting with Ellie in the empty lot across the street from the apartment. I'm only moving a few blocks away, I thought. We all do it. It's a natural part of life. But I couldn't hold back the tears. On the last day of our lease, I returned for some minor cleaning. When I finished, I sat in my empty bedroom and wept. I felt so much grief I must have sat there for hours. I was reminded of a visit to my childhood home the year after we'd moved out. Fergie, our cat who ran away before we could give her away, appeared from nowhere and strolled up to my mom and me. "Do you think she remembers us?" I asked Mom. "Of course she does," she said. We pet her for a couple of minutes and then said goodbye like we never got the chance to. Confrontation. After the conversation I had with Philip McKernan about my fears around losing Dad, I flew down to have the conversation with him. The conversation every man wishes he had before his father passed away. Toward the end of that trip, more repressed childhood pain resurfaced. I had dedicated 10 days of my life to spend time with him, and he'd found every reason he could to work more and see me less. I felt that this meant he didn't care about me, when really he was just afraid. One morning after breakfast, I finally caved. Dad had told me today was going to be his day off, but still found a way to make it his busiest of the trip. He crammed his breakfast and then left the table to go run errands. When he picked us up, He drove us around and ran more errands. It was one of my last days in town, and this was not how I wanted to spend it. But I felt trapped, like it wasn't up to me to make that call. I was along for a ride only my dad could control. I was a teenager again, at the mercy of his life. When we finally made it back home, I stormed off to the pool and stared out at the ocean. I felt that once again, Dad had failed to follow through with his word. But unlike my younger self, I couldn't avoid my sadness by getting angry anymore. It hurt too much. I reached for my towel and buried my face in it as the tears came. I wanted to drown out the sound of my sadness so that nobody could hear it. Dad noticed anyway. He walked toward me and stood a few feet away on the sand. From muscle memory, my body tensed up and my tears dried up. I don't get to be sad around my dad because it makes him sad to see me like that, and it's my job to make sure he doesn't feel that way. "So what do you want to do with the rest of the day?" Dad asked. I shrugged my shoulders because to speak would have made me cry again. "Do you want to go watch a movie?" "Sure, whatever," I said. Then I stood up and started for my bedroom. Dad tried to stop me as I crossed his path. He asked if I was upset, and all I could do was shake my head and walk away. I went inside my room and locked myself in it. Then I lay in bed, curled up in the fetal position, and wept. There was no one left to protect but myself. Once in hiding, I fully allowed myself to feel hurt. And man, when I say that words can't describe how intense the feeling was, that's an understatement. It was like my hero's dose of psilocybin mushrooms, only without the comfort that the medicine provides. I felt alone, abandoned, unloved, unworthy, scared, disoriented, and a whole slew of other difficult emotions. On top of that, I felt guilt, because I still felt responsible for protecting Dad, and I didn't feel like I was doing that right now. I was doing the opposite. By feeling my emotions, I was directly impacting his. I heard a knock on the door, followed by Dad's voice. "Open up," he said. "Come on, let me in." I ignored it and he went away. Then he came back and repeated himself. I ignored it again. It wasn't until the third time, after nearly an hour of crying, that I finally decided to let him in. "What's wrong?" he asked, still shirtless in his bathing suit. I closed the door. We sat down. Up until this point, this moment was not entirely new. I can think of dozens of times I felt hurt by Dad and was later found crying by him, and even more times where I completely hid it from him. But this wasn't about reliving trauma, it was about rewriting it. There was an opportunity staring me in the face. If I wanted to seize it, I had to trust there was light at the bottom of this deep, dark well I was about to jump into. "I'm hurt," I finally said. "You haven't stopped working since I got here. You can't spend time with me, your son, who you haven't seen in 2 years. That hurts." "I don't think that's fair," he said. "We've talked more than ever this time around." "Don't tell me what's fair and what isn't. I feel hurt. That's not for you to decide anymore. You reserve the time we spent together for the last 3 hours of the day when you're too exhausted to even stay awake. You don't care, do you?" "Of course I care. I care a lot. You think I don't feel bad? That I don't see how it's wrong? Work just coincided with your trip. A lot of it. Work always coincides with my trips. You prioritize work over our relationship, or any relationship for that matter. When does it end?" "You think I could just drop everything like that," he said. "I didn't say that." "You think money doesn't matter? Well, it does, and I don't ever want to run out of it." "I didn't say that either. You just don't like it when people tell you things the way they really are." "I don't like it when people lie. Stop trying to manipulate me." Dad laughed. I felt horrible for what I was doing. But if I wanted to rewrite this moment, I couldn't shrink this time. "You don't know anything about me," I said. "Of course I do," he said. "You're my son. Of course I know you." Who am I? What do I like to do in my free time? What are my friends' names? Why did I drop out of college? What am I passionate about? Dad was silent. You don't care about me. You only care about yourself. I do care. Then how come you never show it? I'm trying, Dad said. It's hard. Maybe I wasn't the best dad. Maybe I fucked you up. Maybe it's my fault that you did all the things you did to hurt yourself. It's not easy trying to mend that. It wasn't your fault. I'm sorry. Really, I'm sorry for the ways I can be. I don't want you to be sorry, I said. I want you to care. I do care. Again, I said, why don't you ever show it? How do I do that? He asked. You ask about my life and spend time with me. You ask about the things I care about. But I've heard about those things from others already. So you'll ask others, but not me? Why is it always from others that you learn about me? Because I'm afraid, he finally said. And maybe it's hard for me to confront that fear. Dad and I talked for several hours in that room. It would be impossible for me to recount everything that was said. What matters is what the conversation represented. My whole life I was afraid of Dad. Afraid I wasn't good enough for him. Afraid he didn't love me. Afraid to tell him how I felt. Afraid to hurt him. Through my relationship with him, I learned to make myself small in front of others. I developed an idea of self that was distorted. I would constantly sacrifice myself to please or protect him. That's part of the reason I sacrificed myself to sexually please strange men. I thought that if I did that enough times, my father wound would disappear. It didn't. But when I unlocked the door and let him in that day, when I told him I was hurt because of the choices he made and the course that he put into action as a father, I rewrote a part of the script. I rewrote the part that ended with me feeling both of our emotions and taking the toll for it, while he lived in denial and judged me for it. I stopped protecting him and let him see the real me. It's not his fault that I never told him how I felt, or his responsibility to change the course that I put into action. Only I can do that. After that conversation, our connection grew stronger than ever before. We spent the next 2 years really getting to know each other. All of my negative feelings toward him were replaced with love and compassion. We hugged and said I love you often. He became the most important person in the world to me. And on the second Tuesday of 2023, he died at the young age of 65. Now that he's gone, my only regret is that we didn't do this sooner. My first real Merry Christmas. I used to have a lot of baggage around the holidays. I was afraid to celebrate them for fear that I'd be made fun of. My birthday, though not a holiday per se, I only got excited about secretly. When people called to wish me a happy birthday, I acted like I didn't care. When I grew older, I worried every time a holiday was around the corner. Worried I wouldn't find anyone to celebrate with. Worried I'd be a loser if I didn't celebrate. My narrative was that holidays are lonely and sad, which was true for most of my life. Holidays equaled grief, and I have a lockbox full of memories that support this claim, like the haunted house I nearly shat myself in before the age of 9. The one I didn't want to go into but did anyway because no one would stay outside with me. There are Christmases where I was called ungrateful by my parents and Christmases where one of them was absent. You get the point. Holidays equaled grief, and when they do, they become hard to celebrate. In 2020, I rewrote my holiday script. I decided I was going to put away my Grinch costume, put on my fat suit, and be fucking merry for once. In late November, I was at work when my boss walked in on me doing prep and listening to a Christmas playlist on Spotify. She said, "Fan of Christmas music, huh?" I'm usually not, I said, but I'm trying to change that this year. Are you? Nah, I'm a Grinch when it comes to Christmas. When she left, I felt my energy drop. I thought maybe I should change the music in case customers found it annoying too. Then something beautiful happened. Right after she left, a woman came to pick up her order. I opened the food truck window to greet her. "Oh," she said, surprised. "I love that you're playing Christmas music." This one small interaction reaffirmed my desire to be merry. By choosing to celebrate, I impacted someone else's energy, and they impacted mine. It was exactly what I needed to see how negative I used to be around holidays. 2 weeks later, my brother invited me to spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day with him and his girlfriend Evelyn at her mom's house. My ego heard it first and ran with it. He probably wants you to say no so he can spend it with them alone. They probably want you to say no too, so they don't have to have a stranger over for Christmas. If you say yes, you're going to regret it. You're going to feel awkward. Don't go. The night of Christmas Eve, we ate dinner and played Cards Against Humanity. The next morning, we opened gifts in the living room with 3 dogs present, each with their own stocking. Evelyn's mom cried when she opened Todd's. I held back tears when Evelyn opened mine. We laughed, we took pictures, and we ate candy. I can remember 1 or maybe 2 Christmases that felt similar growing up. They were the ones we spent with my grandparents in California. But somewhere along the way, I lost the ability to enjoy Christmas and started to minimize its value. When I drove home afterward, I cried. It had been so long since I felt like I had people to spend Christmas with. It opened me up to my joy as well as Todd's joy and the loving family he'd found in Evelyn. I almost can't even put into words how good it felt to connect with him by connecting with his new life. It was just like, fuck yeah, dude. We made it out. We're building something good here. Chapter 40. Compassion in the Face of Relapse. There's a hard truth about healing wounds that isn't talked about often. It's that once I start doing the work, it gets harder before it gets easier. I wish I'd known this going in because it was the first thing my critics would shine a light on and the thing I became most insecure about. If I'm healing, then why does everything feel so much harder? My dad said something to me that perfectly encapsulates what I mean by critics shining a light on this. He said, "Why are you doing this to yourself? All you're doing is suffering. Those who don't believe I need to heal my wounds will see my pain as indicators that they're right. Their identity depends on the core belief that pain is to be avoided at all costs." When I began to heal, I felt immense pressure to make no mistakes. If I did, my parents would say, "I told you so." This belief, that I am better than that, was a wound in and of itself. I had zero compassion for myself. It didn't matter if I stumbled or fell face first on the ground. I used to view every slip-up as an indicator that I was still broken. What my culture didn't teach me, and what is the most important lesson I have taken away from these first few years of healing, is that without exception, my parents, my siblings, my friends, my coworkers, my grandparents, my mentors, my idols, my gods, we all fall down. The goal is not to avoid falling down. The goal is to learn how to love myself, even when I do fall down. Every time I exercise compassion in the face of relapse, I grow stronger. Instead of the shame spiral that I'm used to, I get to be my biggest empath. I'm not a failure. I'm a human being. Compassion in those moments means choosing to see that. One last note on this chapter and the word relapse. Merriam-Webster defines relapse as the act or an instance of backsliding, worsening, or subsiding, and a recurrence of symptoms of a disease after a period of improvement. When I refer to my own examples of relapse, I define the word as such: the act of coping with pain in ways that no longer serve me. I am not worsening when I relapse. My wounds are not diseases. Those views are rooted in shame. My view is rooted in compassion and understanding. Whatever behavior I use to cope with pain can be replaced with one that better serves me. But I don't make the behavior I want to replace my enemy. I'm not at war with myself. Every time I relapse, I must remember that at a certain time and place in my life, this behavior actually saved me. This behavior provided me with a solution to an otherwise unsolvable problem. The rest of this chapter consists of different times throughout my healing when I have stumbled. I chose to make it the last chapter because I still fall down, often. It's a reminder for you and me that the finish line is not perfection. The first time after Kiki. It had been over a year since I'd last met up with a man from the internet. It had been a month or two since the breakup. It hadn't crossed my mind until then that the loneliness I was feeling could go away temporarily. After my trip to the World Series of Poker in Las Vegas, fighting the urge to escape only made it stronger. I was sad and I felt I was worthless. I felt I deserved to be used. When my first date after Kiki didn't go well, my thoughts grew harsh. I beat myself up for going on the date and for not performing well. When it ended, I left the bar and walked a few blocks down the street to a gas station. I reached out to my plug and bought $60 worth of weed. Then I went home and got high. With weed now in my possession, pulling the trigger was easy. I found an old man who lived alone in Hyde Park. I smoked a lot of weed before I met him. I was nauseous and paranoid when I arrived. He was giddy. He brought me inside his home and immediately put his hands on me. He undressed me and made me undress him. Then he tried putting himself in my mouth several different ways until he found a position that felt good to him. After a while of hearing me choke and gag, he noticed my face was covered in tears. He stopped and asked if I was okay. Disoriented and in full pleasing mode, I nodded yes. I was not okay. I wanted this to end. He kept going and began to insult me now. Then he finished inside me and let out a big exhale. I washed up in his bathroom, got dressed, and called a ride. The whole way home my body felt numb and my mind raced with shame. I felt disappointed in myself. When I shared what happened with my therapist, I expected him to be disappointed too. He wasn't. He was compassionate. He reframed a lot of my automatic negative thoughts about the situation. He reminded me that this behavior had served me at one point in my life. After our session, the shame went away. It was true. The last few months had been hard for me. A lot of painful emotions resurfaced that for me to have relapsed almost made sense. I just expected myself to manage everything perfectly and make no mistakes along the way. But this was an expectation I was going to have to let go of. The last time I saw her. Weeks after the Hyde Park meetup and months after the breakup, Wes and I got together for drinks at a bar on the east side of Austin. My grief had subsided. I no longer cried in the restroom at work. I'd started to visit public spaces again, like my favorite food truck and different hiking trails on the Greenbelt. Myself was a word I had started to feel like again. As Wes and I entered the bar, we noticed a large group of coworkers gathered in the corner for a happy hour. Wes turned to me and said, "Oh, Kiki's here." My heart stopped and my body froze. "I'm just fucking with you," he said. I let out a big exhale. We found a seat outside and started a conversation about how we'd never been single at the same time. I was excited that we finally were. Wes made an observation about the people at this bar, and as I turned to look at what he was pointing out, I noticed a familiar face sitting inside, across from another familiar face. I said, "Fuck me, dude. Don't look." "What?" "Kiki's actually here," I said. "No way," he said. He looked exactly where I told him not to. "That is Kiki. Is she on a date?" No, I said. That's her coworker, Elia. Then it hit me that the whole time I was with Kiki, I'd felt that Elia had a crush on her. The thought that they could be on a date devastated me. I pushed it away. But maybe they were. Wes said, "Are you going to say hi?" "Do you think I should?" "I don't know. Do you want to leave?" No, I'm fine. Let's just go back to our conversation." Wes made the same observation he had about the people at this bar, but this time I didn't really listen. All I could think about was that Kiki sat a few feet away from me. We hadn't exchanged so much as a "hope you're doing well" in the time since we broke up. The only form of communication had come when she blocked me from her private Instagram account. "Actually, I think we should leave," I said. "Okay, yeah, I'll just close out. I'm going to use the restroom and then go say hi. I'll meet you at your car." I'll never forget the way Kiki looked at me when I approached her. The same look was on her face the first time we kissed, and the first time I told her I loved her. It was a mix of surprise and delight. I stood next to her and Elia not happy to see me, and I said, "Kiki." "Nick," she said. "Hi, how have you been?" "I've been good. I don't really know what to say, but I wanted to say something." We held eye contact for what felt like a full minute. Then Kiki jumped out of her seat and hugged me. Her hug felt like forgiveness. "It's really good to see you," I said. "It's really good to see you too," she said. We separated and Kiki sat back down. I exchanged an awkward hello with Elia. Then I left. And as soon as I walked outside of the bar, I broke down. I hurried to Wes's car and didn't find him there. I felt excruciating pain and I wanted to hide it. Wes finally arrived and found me leaning against the trunk of his car, crying. "Aw, dude, what's up?" he said. "I'm just really sad, man." We got in the car. I didn't want to cry, but I couldn't hold back. I felt shame for feeling this way. It'd been a while now. Why was I still so sad? Why couldn't I just get over it already? Seeing Kiki on social media was one thing, but holding her in my arms again, her face next to mine, was something entirely different. Being that close to her overwhelmed me. It served as a painful reminder I'd wanted to avoid for weeks. It reminded me just how not over her I was. It's been said before, but it begs repeating, that grief is not a linear process. One day I can feel on top of the world, and the next I can feel like it's the first day all over again. When I was younger, people would always ask me when I would get over it. I felt pressured to find an answer, so I arbitrarily decided that 2 months for every year the relationship had lasted was enough. People asked because they didn't know how to be there for me. Perhaps this is why 2 months was never actually enough. As I write this, it's been over 2 years since Kiki and I broke up. I don't think about her nearly as much. In fact, I rarely do. But rarely isn't never. The best thing I have found to help me grieve is to give up the idea of there being a finish line. There's nothing wrong with being sad a long time after the events I'm grieving. Getting emotional when I talk about it doesn't mean I haven't finished grieving, because again, there is no finish line. Whether it's a breakup or a loved one's death, it's going to be with me forever. The idea of a finish line is really a masked way of asking to get rid of pain. And pain is the one thing I'll never get rid of. I can only feel pain, and by doing that, lessen its burden on my existence. After I run into Kiki, it feels as though life gets progressively harder. My ketamine infusions and the new woman I'm seeing bring up so many difficult emotions that I relapse again. The 2020 lockdowns are in full effect. My brother is staying at his girlfriend's apartment, which means I have hours all to myself. People are afraid to go outside because the media is telling us we could die if we do. But I'm in so much emotional pain that I don't care. I want someone to use me. Most of the men I email don't want to have strangers come over, so I do something I've only done once before. I invite a man to my apartment. As soon as he confirms that he's on his way, my body begins to tremble. I sit by my bedroom window and wait for the car he described to arrive. When I see it, I spray twice the recommended amount of ketamine up my nose and wait for the high and the knocking to come. I let him in and walk to my bedroom. He's short, buff, and bald. He looks like a mix between a truck driver and a retired wrestler. He sits on the edge of my bed and I kneel on the floor. He says, "So I can't fuck you in the ass, right?" Not this time," I say. "Okay, well, at least let me put my fingers inside." I say, "What do I do?" "Compromise." "I have a butt plug. Do you want to use that?" "Yeah." I grab the butt plug and let him penetrate me with it. When he's satisfied, he pushes it in all the way and leaves it there. He turns me around to face him and fucks my mouth for 5 minutes before finishing inside it. Then he gets dressed and walks out of my room without saying goodbye or once looking me in the eyes. When he leaves, I lock the door and cry until I'm numb. A month later, a man pays $40 for a car to bring me to his house. I arrive to find that it's not his home, it's his uncle's, and his uncle is home. I go into the man's bedroom with him. He shows me his toys and asks which one I want to start with. I pick one. "Did you clean yourself already?" he asks. "I took a shower, yeah." "But did you flush out?" I don't know. I don't think so." "Okay," he says. "Come here. I'll help you." The man proceeds to teach me how to flush all the residual shit out of my asshole. He lets me shower afterward. Then he bends me over on his bed, resumes the movie Inception on his television, and proceeds to penetrate my ass with his different sized toys. Every now and then he asks me to blow him. After an hour of this, he says his friend is finally on the way. "Okay," I say. "You said you don't want us to fuck you in the ass, right?" Not this time," I say. He texts his friend and then continues to play with me. This is the first time I've felt like the man using me actually cares about me, and it makes me go soft and want to leave. Maybe I panic because his friend's almost here, and I've never blown 2 men at once. Or maybe I'm finally giving myself permission to set boundaries. I don't know, but my feelings have changed, and I don't want to do this anymore. This time I speak up. "I'm really sorry," I say, "but I think I'm going to go home." "Shit. It's because I asked about anal, isn't it?" No, I say. "I don't know what it is. I just don't feel very well. I need to go home." "Are you sure? My friend's almost here." "Yeah, I'm sorry." In the car on the way home, I don't cry. I feel less shame. I tell myself this was exploratory, not exploitative. There is nothing wrong with what I've done. I don't need to pay for my sins. I don't need to start all over again. I don't need to buy into the narrative that this means I'm broken. And I don't tell my therapist about it. Some more time passes. Todd and I are a month out from our move-out date. It's been 2 weeks since I had my first hero's dose mushroom trip. A lot of emotion has surfaced. Everywhere I look, I feel something. The past blurs my perception of reality. I can't deal with it, so I turn to the listings again. I exchange emails with men for several days before I invite one over to my apartment. I don't care that it's dangerous. I mean, I do, but I just don't believe that it actually is. Until the man arrives to my apartment and I open the door for him to come inside. He's 3 inches taller than me, 70 pounds stronger, and a stranger. He could rape and murder me if he wanted to, and there would be nothing I could do about it. As soon as he enters my apartment, I feel the power shift over to him. We go into my bedroom, turn off the lights, and undress. When I see his black cock flop out of his clothes, I worry. It's the biggest one I've ever seen, and it's not even hard. He grabs me by the arms and turns me around. He pushes me onto my bed face down and spreads my legs. I feel a shiver run through me. What's he doing? I told him I don't do anal. I try to turn around, but he presses his entire body weight against my back. I feel his cock pressing against my ass cheeks. I finally blurt out, "Hey, no anal, okay?" "I know," he says. "But why not?" "I don't know. I've never done it before." "I can teach you." "No." He gets up, sits on my desk chair, and says, "Come here then, bitch." I crawl over to him. He pushes my head down to the base of his cock. I gag and choke. "I'm in charge," he says. "You understand?" I try to speak but can't, so I just make a noise. He grabs me by the head and ragdolls me. After 5 minutes, I feel my throat irritate. It feels like I'm bleeding. He doesn't stop. He only goes harder and talks to me like I'm nothing, and calls me names I've never been called before. When I try to take breaks, he slaps me and says, "Get it back in. Do your fucking job, bitch." The ketamine hits me right around then. I become nauseous and start to dissociate. He knows where I live. He's going to want to do this again. He might not ask permission next time. Why did I do this? How do I make it stop? How long am I going to cry for after he leaves? Am I going to learn my lesson this time? I'm such a fucking broken piece of shit. No compassion. It takes him an hour to finish. Before he leaves, he says, "I'ma see you again soon." I go into the bathroom to inspect my throat. It's red and there is a minor cut in the very back of it. When I wake up the next morning, it feels like I smoked a carton of cigarettes. For 2 weeks, I don't speak about the night. I try to hide it from myself by getting real fucking busy. Finally, I tell my therapist about it. He doesn't react the way I expect him to, which is how my dad and my mom would react if I told them. He understands. The questions he asks are not judgmental. They're intended to give me clarity. "I just feel like I'm not actually doing the work, or else this wouldn't have happened," I say. "It's because you're doing the work that this happened. You're digging up so much pain that you don't yet have tools to cope with. If none of it was working, you wouldn't be escaping from it." Then I write in my diary about it. Then a month later, I talk about it on my podcast. And after those 3 moments of honesty, all of the shame goes away. It was never the acts that caused me the pain. It was my inability to accept them as a part of my humanity that did. My burning desire to be perfect. From there, Todd and I move into our new apartment. I grieve the memories I'll miss and the nightmares I won't. I make a promise to love myself more in my new home. I free space in my body and mind to start a new chapter in my life, though I don't know what it'll look like yet. 2 weeks later, I free enough headspace to tell my story again, and I write the first chapter of this book. Epilogue. I don't believe in happy endings, but it's not because I don't believe in happiness. I just don't believe in endings. Not after breakups, not after loss. To some extent, everything stays with us or with someone or something else after us. I do believe in happiness, but it took me a while to get there, and some days I believe in it more than others. However, I don't believe happiness waits for endings to show itself. It's a choice I make every day. Since the events that I wrote about in this book, I have stumbled and had to relearn many of the same lessons. I've met women I wasn't supposed to be in relationships with and come close to doing just that. I've judged and been judged. I've continued to fight myself on matters concerning inner peace and love. I've also learned a lot of new lessons and been of service to people I love. I'm learning to take a more fluid approach to life. Most importantly, I'm learning to let myself be. Be me. Be human. be flawed, be real. In the final days of writing this, I met a woman and started to rewrite an old script with her. I allowed myself to soften again. I let go of the protective shell I'd built after Kiki. It wasn't easy to let go of. It wasn't easy to give a damn and show it, to not fall back on my old ways. We were together for 6 months, and this time I didn't lie and I didn't cheat. I loved wholeheartedly and allowed the relationship to unfold naturally. Thank you for allowing me to share a part of my journey with you.